Welcome back. As you're probably aware, I haven't uploaded a video in 3 months. Yeah. I swear there's a good reason for that though. You see, Meatballcraft's Chapter 2 is essentially an entire mod pack on its own. I mean, it consists of what is practically the entire progression of several large content mods, plus a bunch of custom content the pack adds itself. I was not prepared for the sheer scale of this chapter, and apparently neither was my upload schedule. But hey, here I am, and I'm charging Certus quartz. You see, Certus quartz is to this mod pack as sand is to a beachgoer, an important resource to be harvested and processed. Fluix, a combination of redstone quartz and charged Certus quartz, is this cool purple crystal that enables you to do a bunch of things with everybody's favorite storage mod, Applied Energistics 2. It also apparently has the worst conversion rate of all time, but that's another story. However, at the moment, Applied Energistics 2 can wait, because Fluix also has another fun purpose, gating basically everything magic. By crushing up Fluix into a powder, then using the elite crafting table I obtained last episode to craft Fluix seeds, I can obtain pure Fluix crystals by letting the seeds sit in water for a little bit. And when I say a little bit, I actually mean the rest of my life, because it turns out that someone thought time gating the only method of progression at this point in the game was a good idea. Thankfully, there are other things to do, namely killing Cyclops. Meatballcraft is unique in being the only mod pack I've ever played to consistently pull 180s on whatever my current objective is whenever I blink. This is due to a multitude of factors, but at the end of the day, it's really just because every single recipe was a combination of mob drops, tech gadgets, and magic bits and bobs. To make the Druid altar, I'm going to need some pure Fluix, but also some Cyclops eyes and other miscellaneous odds and ends, which I will obtain shortly. A Druid altar? What's that? You may be asking yourself. Simply put, it's the first of several altars I'm going to need for progression. It's also the simplest. You put 4 broken pieces of talisman in it, and it combines them into a somewhat musty smelling trinket you can use as an all expenses paid travel ticket to the Betweenlands. You might notice though, I'm not currently going to the Betweenlands or performing any bog rituals at Druid altars. In fact, I'm actually just going apparel shopping at my favorite outlet, that being an interdimensional rift that summons a bunch of cultists. Maybe the main reason this video took so long is because I would keep getting sidetracked, but that's besides the point. After my short shopping trip, I make the combination crafter, a pseudo multi-block added in by everyone's favorite mod, extended crafting. If you're new to modded, I hope you understand why I crammed this thing into a random corner cave to never be cared for again. It is the least interesting crafting method anyone could possibly choose to do, and is currently, and for the foreseeable future, will only serve like 2 purposes, those being the production of a Necromonicon and quartz fibers from AE2. Neither of these items I need in excess, and seeing that the combination crafter is really just a knockoff infusion altar slash abyssal craft ritual slash really anything else that involves putting things on pedestals and having them combine with the thing in the center, I have little reason to care for the device. Now, why exactly do I need a Necromonicon and quartz fibers? Well, remember how I mentioned that the speed at which pure Fluix crystals grow is so ridiculous that the full crystals will probably fully formed after the heat death of the universe? Yeah, well there's a way to speed the process up. Our friends over at AE2 Unofficial Extended Life have given us the Crystal Growth Accelerator to help us with our crystal growing woes. Only problem is that it needs to be powered, and lowly RF cables aren't going to make the cut. That's why the energy acceptor comes into play. In all honesty, I've never really found a use for these things because I usually power my AE2 network directly at the controller, but there is currently no AE2 network to be powered, so energy acceptor it is. Sadly, the energy acceptor needs these funny little things called redstone and quartz chipsets added by an obscure mod known as Buildcraft. To make these, I need yet another pseudo multi-block, this one being the assembly table. Unlike the affront to God the combination crafter is, I have very little to say about the assembly table besides the fact that the lasers look cool. After a long time of waiting around and watching paint dry, if by paint I mean lasers and by dry I mean caress the surface of the assembly table, I got all the chipsets I needed to make the energy acceptor. With a little bit of smeltery action to get manual in, I could craft up the energy acceptor and power the only thing that is preventing my sanity from taking a permanent vacation in some dingy motel. You see this dirt pit filled with water? That, my friend, is what progress looks like. Except you might notice that my cables seem to be completely drained of energy. Looks like my energy generation somehow ran out of lava? Yeah, I have no clue how this happened, but hey, looks like I got my first pure Fluix crystals. So, the combination crafter. Yeah, it's time for its second purpose, that being the Necronomicon. I probably said Necromonicon a few times, but whatever, it's a hard word to pronounce. Some fun modded Minecraft trivia is that Abyssalcraft actually has a fairly robust magic system. Despite being rather obnoxious to use and generally taking up a ton of time, it's still pretty interesting, and the Necronomicon is the heart of it all. With a little bit of pure fluix, a book, some runium, and some rotten flesh, we got ourselves an abridged to the point where the book is more like a pamphlet guide to the abyss, with which I can use to power rituals and be a menace to our neighbors. The specific ritual we're after crafts a transmutation gem, one of the ingredients in making the old druid altar. So after using some eldritch magic, read, shift-clicking some cobblestone, to make an altar, I go in search of a way to charge my book up with a potential energy. The best way to obtain the somewhat inaccurately named potential energy is through death, and thankfully I have a convenient pit of shadows at the bottom of the world with which to massacre hundreds. Inconveniently, however, harnessing this death requires monolith stone, a resource solely obtained by bothering some of my neighbors. Even more inconveniently, these neighbors happen to be slimy eldritch abominations inspired by the works of H.P. I'm Famous for Cthulhu Lovecraft. In the end, though, it really wasn't too difficult to kill them. Now, with the power of a fresh-off-the-shelf sacrificial altar, I can harness some death from the aforementioned pit of shadows at the bottom of the world, and just like that, I had myself a transmutation gem. Would you look at that? A druid altar. Finally, a Swamp Talisman. Now to enter the Betweenlands. All I need to do is place down a sapling and use the talisman to summon a portal tree in this very temporary location. I love the Betweenlands. In fact, I would go so far as to say that it is the single best dimension mod. Has great textures, unique boss fights, its own soundtrack, good world building, the list just goes on and on. Despite all that though, that is not why we're visiting the vast swamp. No, we're visiting it for the sake of shingles. Yeah, it's pretty underwhelming to hear that all of that progression was just for some roof deco, but the reality is we need a roof. It's just a matter of necessity. Specifically, I want mud tile shingles, which need mud, obviously. For some strange reason, Betweenlands mud doesn't have an EMC value, so I crafted an alchemical bag from Project E because we were going to need a lot of mud. Also, for those unaware, an alchemical bag is a bag that comes in one of 16 colors with a very, very large inventory. Each color shares an inventory, so if you misplace or destroy a bag, you can still access your goods without having to deal with the fact that your poor storage management has resulted in you putting a warehouse's worth of items somewhere where you will never find them. With the bag in hand, I entered the so-called dank world and immediately put my pickaxe to work, extracting all the mud, dirt, and stone in my vicinity. If the Betweenlands had any sort of EPA, they would have probably devoted an entire department to stopping me, but by the time any bureaucracy could have stopped me, it would have also already been too late. That is to say, I returned to the overworld and cooked up my mud into bricks, made my bricks into shingles, and began slathering them onto the roof of my wooden box. With that minor base expansion out of the way, it was time to get down and dirty with the undisputed king of magic mods, Thaumcraft. While I did dabble in it a little in the last episode, research was basically completely unavailable to us due to tables requiring pure fluix, but I'm past that now. Okay, I sort of lied. Thaumcraft 4 is the undisputed king of magic mods. Thaumcraft 6 is more like his bratty son that still has some of the glimmer of royalty, but still needs to grow up a little. That is especially seen in TC6's research. God, I hate TC6 research. I know some people like it. I'm not going to say it isn't a cool concept, but having to retrieve random items every 6 seconds is not only tedious, but nowhere near as interesting as the puzzle-based TC4 research. Regardless, research was something I had to do, so after crafting some Nitor to fuel my crucible, I began a short research session, which went as follows. Wasn't that entertaining? Anyway, this may come as a surprise to you, but all of that research was for the sake of decorating my base. Look, Warded glass looks cool, there's just no arguing with that. I think I do need to explain something here actually. My progress is basically completely based on how large my base is. Like, I'm not going to get anything done unless I have an area in my base to get it done in. So if this deco stuff sounds trivial, it is. But I swear to God, without it, nothing at all is getting done. Speaking of building, I expanded my smeltery to increase its constant tin production capacity. Why increase its constant tin production capacity? I need more power. A lot more power. And this can be accomplished with my favorite method of power production in the game, numismatic dynamos with the lipidiary calibration augment. Wow! That was a whole bunch of shit that meant absolutely nothing. Okay. Basically, numismatic dynamos are generators from thermal expansion that eat coins to produce power. On its own, this is a pretty good method of generating power, but lipidiary calibration augments basically take the challenge out of power generation. Like, my entire LUV base in Modi Factory CEU was powered solely by numismatic dynamos with lipidiary calibration augments. Why is this augment so good? It changes the fuel for the dynamo from coins to gemstones and significantly boosts the power output. Additionally, the best gemstones possible are diamonds, and we have an infinite source of diamonds. Yeah, we're basically set for the rest of the episode. I've made the executive decision to put my diamond eaters in the basement, as I don't really feel like building up an area above ground for them. I actually went through a good few drafts of this room, but I eventually got into a serviceable state. Any good power generation system needs a complementary power storage system, so I also install an Ender IO capacitor bank right next to my diamond eaters. I have a rocky relationship with Ender IO capacitors. They're good at energy storage, they're configurable, but goddamn do they take up space. With a capacitor bank snugly tucked between my crystal munchers and moved down the Dragonheart EMC loop to localize fuel production, once the diamonds were flowing again, the capacitor filled up relatively quickly if I dare say so myself, so that's basically the power issue solved. Naturally though, if we're going to have power generation, we should probably also have power consumption, so I begin the construction of a second floor to my wooden box. I may be being generous when I say machine hall here, but hey, it's a start. You know, the idea of a machine hall is really funny when you think about it. Like, where the hell in the real world are people lining the walls of their factories with machines like that? Like, it feels natural in game, but nothing like that in reality would ever exist. Earlier I mentioned that this mod pack likes pulling 180s every few seconds. Keeping up with the trend, it's time to fight our first boss of Chapter 2, the Ancient Entity. It wasn't really a hard boss, as it didn't really attack, but due to its unfortunate hitbox placement, I couldn't attack it without taking damage, which resulted in me having to resort to ranged weapons. Besides, accidentally catching some of my forest on fire, much to the disappointment of Smokey Bear, the boss fight wasn't too eventful, and once defeated, the Ancient Entity netted me, well, nothing too useful at the moment, but I'm sure whatever it dropped will come in handy later. Speaking of 180s, it's time to start growing crops. Yeah. You see, Bewitchment, a magic mod that is basically the spiritual successor of witchery, requires that you have a fresh supply of, quote, magical plant stuff at your disposal. By, quote, magical plant stuff, I really just mean garlic, mandrakes, and several different poisonous flowers, because apparently that's all you need to start a magical apothecary. Well, almost all. Any self-respecting hedge witch would know you also need an altar, which similarly to the research table, has been previously gated by pure fluix. It also required some clay jars, but those weren't really too much of an issue as they just needed some runium and clay. Unlike a lot of tech mods, each magic mod's power system varies in the ways energy is produced, stored, transferred, and consumed. But Bewitchment's altar is a good example of that. Essentially, the altar functions as a sort of generator that is in charge of providing mystical apparatuses with magical energy. As long as whatever you're trying to power is close enough to the altar, it should take energy out of the altar's total energy capacity. The rate at which the altar generates energy and the max amount of energy the altar can hold is determined by the amount of unique vegetation you have around the altar and can be affected by some special items you can place on top of it. Conveniently, my base is partly covered in vegetation. I have crafted some of the required ornaments for the top of the altar, so we're pretty much in business. As for energy consumption, I've made a witch's cauldron and witch's oven, which serve as the mod's primary crafting stations. With a witch's oven, I begin producing some liquid witchcraft by burning mandrakes and bottling up the smoke? Or maybe the liquid? I'm not really sure. Regardless, it is a major component in ritual chalk, another staple of the mod. To be honest, I don't think I perform a single ritual in this entire chapter. Like, maybe I did at some point, but it must have been, like, inconsequential enough to the point that I forgot about it while script writing, and the lack of its existence doesn't really cause any plot holes. Moving on, I crafted the distillery, which is sort of a secondary device used to make more advanced bottles of stuff. Earlier on, I mentioned how you can increase an altar's power by placing stuff on top. Well, after I finished drawing a bunch of doodles on the pavement of my base, I decided my altar needed to be a little more beefy, so I added a candelabra and a silver knife to get a small energy boost. Much to my regret, the next step in progression required me to find a dragon's blood tree. As I mentioned last episode, exploration is not really my thing, and it took way longer than it probably should have to find one. You know, at least the saplings have EMC. So it might not surprise you at this point, but I needed the dragon's blood tree for decorative purposes. You see, when cut, the tree bleeds dragon's blood resin, an ingredient in bottled hellfire. Bottled hellfire is needed to make statues, which, at least in my eyes, are the coolest feature in the mod. The other key ingredient in bottled hellfire is fiery unguent. Yeah, I don't think I pronounced that right. Regardless, which perhaps to your relief is also used in actually progressing through the pack and not just decorating my base. Actually, I consider the production of fiery unguent to be so important I began to automate it. This was a surprisingly difficult challenge, not so much because of its expense or its complexity, but because witches' ovens have very strange side rules when it comes to item inputs and outputs, which resulted in a fuck ton of jank. At some point I was inputting items to the output. The levels of jank here were so bad I actually just put off automating this till later. Now we need sludge. Why do we need sludge? Conductive powder. But that doesn't matter right now. What does matter is sludge comes from Industrial Foregoing, which I believe is a remake/spiritual successor/sequel to Mine Factory Reloaded, although I could be wrong. What that means is I need to start automating plastic. This isn't really a difficult thing to do, as the machines are cheaper than dirt and all you need to make plastic is wood, logs, water, and power, which feels so wrong after supersymmetry. So what we've got here is a latex processing unit underneath a bunch of tree fluid extractors and next to Nuclearcraft infinite water source. Ender.io fluid conduits feed the latex processor latex from the TFEs and allow the LPU to make latex, which is then taken by a crafter, made into dry rubber, and smelted to make plastic. Normally there would be block placers in front of the TFEs to automate wood log placement, but I'm far too lazy for that. Alright, it's sludge time. A unique feature of Industrial Foregoing is that its plant harvesters build up a waste byproduct called sludge as they operate. They still run while their sludge buffer is full, which I think is a missed opportunity, seeing as forcing players to process waste products presents a cool challenge when you ignore the existence of anything that voids fluids, but I digress. Anyway, I'll use the plastic to make a plant harvester, seed sower, and plant fertilizer, which is pretty much the power trio of getting shit done. After letting the harvester run for a bit, I made the sludge refiner, which, among other things, got me some conductive powder. Now, what was the conductive powder for? Remember how I said I was having trouble getting witches' ovens to cooperate with me? Well, Ender.io has this cool filter that remembers the state of a block's inventory at a given time, and then only allows items to filter in if they follow the filter's blueprint. This allows me to prevent any stray items from getting places they shouldn't. However, to get this filter I needed the Slice and Splice, a machine from Ender.io that basically just crunches stuff up and spits out an item you will only ever need once. This is where the conductive powder comes in, as it is an ingredient in the Slice and Splice. After that, it's simply a matter of some crafting, and I've got myself an existing item filter. Automation can be a very frustrating process, having to deal with all the item logistics, things going where they shouldn't, buffers filling up at the same time, backlogs are draining, horrendous processing speeds. I mean, the list goes on and on. At the same time, though, getting to see all the items do what they are supposed to do is a pretty good feeling, so I guess that makes whatever the fuck this was worth it. I mean, it's not completely automated, as I'm still missing a passive input of cacti and beef, but in terms of janky automation pulled off, I think I did pretty good. The funny part of this operation, though, is I'm not going to really be using any of this fiery unguent until much later on. So, it's good to have it running in the background, but I really should have been automating other stuff at this point in progression. And you know what? I think it's about time I fight another boss. Sure, they don't really help us with progression at the moment, but it's a good way to spend my time. Oh, what do you mean he despawned? Really? Just like that? And I died too? I think I'm gonna need better armor. Coming back from that realization, I did the only thing I know how to do in times of distress and moved my Bellcraft assembly table up to the machine hall. Look, it's my coping mechanism. I get to choose what it is. Also, while we're talking about assembly tables, hot damn do they consume a lot of power. I mean, not so much that it's a concern, but still, in the context of pretty much any similarly functioning machine, it consumes over 10 times the power per laser. Having installed the assembly table into the machine hall, I thought it would finally be appropriate to give it a roof. I'm sure my machines were tired of being rained on every other day. I also deemed it necessary to construct an area for Botania. We'll get more into it in the next part, but I assure you, Botania is important. You like side tangents? Well, I do. I just put multi-jump 3 on my boots. This means I will never have to use the slime sling again. You know what else? I just killed this evil tree dude in the Betweenlands. Yeah, side tangents are great, aren't they? Scriptwriter Pun would like to inform you that this is the only way he could have segued in this random yet somewhat important piece of footage. Now to hit you with yet another nail-biting tangent, I just began mining uranium. With those small tangents behind us, it's time to begin Botania. Who knew foreshadowing worked this fast? There's actually a few reasons why I'm starting Botania before other mods like Astral Sorcery and Blood Magic, so I'll go over them real quick. First off, Botania gives me access to really good armor, and I mean really good. Once it's super enchanted, I'll practically have conditional mortality against most non-boss mobs. Secondly, Botania doesn't have warp like Thaumcraft, so getting into the late game doesn't have any consequences, and I won't have to build a blood altar and grind out sigils, which is really unfun. That aside, the first step in progressing through Botania is crafting the Petal Apothecary. While it may just look like a basin of water, it's actually key to Botania's progression as it allows us to craft flowers with petals, hence the name Petal Apothecary. My first flower, much like pretty much everyone else's, is the Pure Daisy. This is sort of a misnomer as it doesn't really purify resources as it does, quote, alivify them. But that's just Vazgi, I guess. Now, if this were a typical mod pack, I'd probably just go off and start making living stone and living wood with the Pure Daisies, but Meatballcraft adds an additional living gold. While it won't come in useful immediately, I did start crafting it because there's nothing really like a good backlog. Once I had secured a backlog of living gold large enough to make Midas proud, I used my quote living touch to make living rock, which is pretty much just used in place of stone in a lot of Botania's crafting recipes. Keeping true to stopping and smelling the roses, I proceed to go on a worldwide scavenger hunt for different shades of mystical flower, because my snotty Petal Apothecary couldn't care less about vanilla flowers, which are basically low-life scum anyway. Well, my living wood is ready, guess it's time to automate mana production. Being a mod all about unique automation challenges and trying to think outside the box, Botania naturally has a great selection of ways to generate its power. Sadly, unique automation challenges is a phrase commonly attributed with annoying, so I chose the tried and true endoflame spam, which is really no different than your typical combustion generator besides the fact that it has some redstone doohickeys attached to the top of the flowers in order to fully automate them. No, I'm not actually sure of what the general public's opinion is on endoflame spam, but I think it might be seen as a lazy, cheap, and inefficient way to generate mana. Thankfully, lazy, cheap, and inefficient are the only chapter titles in my playbook, so the endoflame is right up my alley. I could explain all the intricacies of mana generation and storage here, but seeing as Botania is really just a tech mod in a magic-flavored costume, you can just think of mana as a unit of energy being spread through air cables or something else like that. I don't know, I'm not a mana philosopher. I think it's time to focus less on mana generation and more on what exactly we're going to do to progress here. This is the Living Rock Pedestal. A fun fact about the Living Rock Pedestal is it's not from Botania. Far from the reaches of sanity, in the pits of otaku hell, a mod called Extra Botany was born, forged from the dying embers of 1,000 burning manga. Basically, 50% of this mod is poorly thought out additions to Botania attempting to improve the base mod, but really just breaking the balance something fierce, and the other half is shitty anime references that I don't get. Don't get me wrong, Botania is rife with these as well, but at least Vazgi attempted to balance mod and decided not to include things like mana storage so ridiculous I had to do a double take once I read about it. But I digress. The Living Rock Pedestal is an intuitive game mechanic where you smash random items with a hammer. Extra Botany, you truly stun me. The sad truth is, though, I'm not going to be progressing through Extra Botany yet. I could have spared you all this ridiculous rant, but hey, is that a runic altar? I hope you're keeping a tally of our altars, because it's only going to get worse. This one I lovingly refer to as the tedium machine, as it takes time to charge up based on your mana throughput and how much mana recipe requires, and basically every recipe needs an inconvenient collection of items from every corner of the world. Remember those 180s, the joke you're getting tired of faster than you're getting tired of me directly asking questions to the audience? Well, it's time to pull one of those off. This one isn't driven by what I like to call the weak Meatballcraft force, however, as this is actually naturally part of Botania's progression. Unfortunately, this is killing the Ender Dragon. I mean, I could just scoop up some Ender Air and call it a day, but if I'm going to kick down the door to the big bad guy's house, I may as well kill him before leaving. My trademark combat prowess, often described as cutting 40 minutes worth of me dying out of the video, makes this fight a breeze. And would you look at that? The dragon's dead. And now I'm off crafting runes, with absolutely no Ender Air in sight. Yep, I killed the dragon for the quest, justifying it as progression through Botania. The first rune I crafted, the mana rune, is by far the least tedious one to craft. But after that, I guess Vazgi decided that turning the game into a fetch quest for a good half an hour would be the best way to engage Botania's players. Here's the thing though, the recipes have been modified by the folks over at the Meatballcraft development team, making them even worse. Was sacrificing a smiley cloud really necessary to make a rune of air? Anyway, by far the worst rune was the water rune though. Like, the rest were tedious, but had nothing on the monstrosity that was the rune of water. Now, is that partially my fault? Naturally. But at the time, I didn't really know there was any other option than to begin a rather lengthy kill-on-sight operation involving large crustaceans. The basics really come down to needing to make an aquatic stone to get a fin to craft a rune, but the aquatic stone requires a bunch of these aquatic pellets that drop from king crabs. The thing is, I didn't need the aquatic stone because the mobs that drop fins spawn naturally, but apparently that just didn't occur to me at the time, so I ended up spending an hour flaying crustaceans. And the worst part was, I didn't even have any old bay. At some point during this process, I realized finding enough king crabs to source the aquatic pellets would be impossible, so I opted to build a mob duplicator and mob crusher from industrial foregoing to automate the process. This saved me a lot of time. Once crabs were flying into crushers faster than I could care to talk about, I crafted the aquatic stone. As I was expecting some sort of, fight, I was taken aback by the selection of limp bodies dumped in the lagoon by my base. After some quick cleanup, I crafted the rune of water, which was the last rune I needed to make the terrestrial agglomeration plate. For those who haven't had the pleasure of playing Britannia before, the terrestrial agglomeration plate is a multi-block device that eats more mana than you can reasonably generate in order to make a green ingot, better known as terresteel. The thing about terresteel is you need a lot of it for a variety of things, and making it the quote traditional way gets tiring very fast. The Meatballcraft devs have provided a solution to this with the existence of the terresteel crystal. Unbeknownst to me at the time, however, this was kind of difficult to get. For those keeping track, as I certainly haven't, I currently have two Britannia related goals. Good armor and the terresteel crystal. This shouldn't change for a while, but things are going to start getting wacky real soon, so just keep those goals in mind. The first real use for terresteel is the one ingot required for crafting the portal to Alfheim. Unlike most portals in this pack, I can't actually travel through it, but it's still important for progression. As with anything Britannia, however, it has an astronomical mana cost, so I doubled my Endoflame mana generation to help lessen the strain on my already exhausted setup. With my mana generation vastly improved, it's time to make some small talk to elves. The portal itself is rather cheap, excluding the terresteel, so now all I have to do is wait for the portal's reservoir mana pools to fill up. This is about as exciting as you'd expect it to be. Really, the main purpose in building the Alfheim portal is to trade with the elves, allowing me to obtain exotic resources like Elementium and Pixie Dust. These resources, in conjunction with mana pylons, make GAIA pylons, which are the first step in summoning a boss known as the GAIA Guardian. In terms of modded bosses, the GAIA Guardian is alright. It's not phenomenal, but at least it tries to make Minecraft's combat interesting, which, let's all be honest here, is a really difficult thing to do. The only thing preventing us from summoning them, however, is a Nether Star. Seeing as I have a mob duplicator, obtaining the skulls for the fight was trivial, and as we all know, the Jeva Wither is one of the biggest pushovers of all time, so this was pretty easy. Against my typical modus operandi, I decided that crafting armor would actually be a good idea for this fight, so we need a fresh set of Elementium armor. I don't actually know if it's good at all, but it can't be terrible once it's enchanted. In an attempt to make the GAIA Guardian not suck, Vazki decided to force you to fight them in an especially configured arena, which, while minimizing some cheese, is just sort of annoying to build after it tells you it's too small for the 80th time. In the last minute before the fight, I got cold feet standing by the arena and decided it would be the best interest to craft the Witherless Rose. After all, the boss does cost an entire terresteel ingot to summon, and dying in some stupid way I could have prevented would not only be embarrassing, but a giant waste of my time. According to some bullshit numbers I just formulated, 57% of player damage during the fight comes from the withering cloud stuff the Guardian leaves on the ground. The Witherless Rose allows me to completely nullify the wither effect for the rather cheap price of 4 nether stars and some random mob drops. Confident in the abilities of my newly acquired trinket, I engage the GAIA Guardian in combat. Ever since my first time doing this, I've always had more than a fair share of questions about them, like why does the boss look like me? Why are they all staticky? How does this have any correlation to GAIA, and why is the GAIA Guardian so shit at its job? This is actually the smoothest I've ever had one of these fights go, and the boss was dead in no time. So what did I get from the GAIA Guardian? Nothing really, besides a means of summoning its stronger incarnation, the GAIA Guardian 2, which I have to admit is quite aptly named, as it is indeed the second GAIA Guardian. The GAIA Guardian 2 is summoned by a GAIA Spirit ingot, an incredibly expensive alloy of terresteel and GAIA Spirits which drop from the GAIA Guardian 1. The ingot is also infamous for being completely useless besides for its ability to summon the GAIA Guardian 2. Although that isn't so much the case in Meatballcraft. Being the go-getter that I am, I summoned the GAIA Guardian 2 as soon as I could, and the funny thing is, I didn't even end up dying to them directly. No, I died to one of the stupid witches it summoned. Apparently being aware of your situation during combat actually helps you win. Having taken this lesson as gospel, I immediately summoned the boss again using my remaining GAIA spirits. This time though, I managed to pull off a victory. though I attribute this more to my habit of power eating enchanted golden apples more so than my newfound knowledge that avoiding enemy attacks help you take less damage. With the GAIA Garden 2 dead, it was time to set my sights on the Dungeons of Arcana. This trademark exclusive dimension from Divine RPG can be accessed by crafting a portal out of these relatively cheap blocks that only require some Botania resources and blue fire stones, which drop from the King of Scorchers. Before even bothering to craft the summon though, I made the Salamander's Eye, which protects me from burning damage and deflects fireballs. This is because over my hours of gameplay in the Nether, I've become aware that the nature of Scorchers is to try and cook you in midair using as much fire as fast as possible, so fire resistance was definitely a little more than just a suggestion coming to this fight. Being an item from Reliquary, the Eye was pretty easy to craft, and now it's time to fight the King of Scorchers. I wish I could say this fight was fun, but who am I kidding? This is a Divine RPG fight, of course it wasn't fun. That being said, the footage is pretty funny. I'm just gonna let the speed up footage play here because I think it really speaks for itself when it comes to expressing my frustration. If I ever have to use a building gadget in the middle of a boss fight again, I'm gonna lose it. But hey, at least I got those blue fire gems. Now I get to go into my first Divine RPG dimension, which I'm sure will be well balanced and fun to explore. In reality, every mob hits like a truck and the entire dimension is a maze. So that sucked worse than my Roomba after I tried to clean up my swimming pool for the third time. Progressing through the Dungeons of Arcana is sort of convoluted, so I just followed exactly as my handy quest book said, which basically was just kill mobs, use their drops to summon another mob, kill that mob to get keys, open some doors with those keys, profit. Sadly, killing the mobs wasn't really something I could do due to their really just ridiculous health pools, so I chose to just take one back home to my base and use my mob duplicator to whisk the problem away. Now that my murder factory was producing free keys for me to explore the Dungeons of Arcana on a whim, I obtained Arcanium, a shiny blue crystal that has EMC, giving me a good excuse never to visit the stupid dimension ever again. This doesn't really seem to be a possibility though, as to my disappointment I had to summon this trader guy in there so I can get these wizard bucks that summon bosses when used on special altars found within the dungeon. Around this time I realized that there is more than one aspect to my quest for Arbor, as it is based on a framework of TerraSteel, meaning that I'm going to need a ludicrous amount of mana to fund this project. This also doubles as an excuse not to fight more Divine RPG bosses, which I think anyone would take in a heartbeat. In terms of mana generation, no flower comes close to how cool the Dandelion is. It's also probably the most complicated, but that just comes with the territory. Simply put, the Dandelion simulates the cellular automata Conway's game of life, and generates mana based on how many generations took place before a certain trigger is met. If you don't know what a cellular automata is, I'm sorry, but its definition kind of falls far outside the scope of this video, but I think once you see how it works, it might make slightly more sense. Interestingly enough, the Dandelion is gated behind GAIA spirits, which seems a little overkill because in all honesty, I'm just making the flower for the novelty of doing so, and a flame spam would still probably be far more efficient. Actually, endoflames would definitely be more efficient, seeing as dandelions take up such a massive amount of space. I mean, seriously, I understand why, but I'd rather not have to clear the giant space for my suboptimal mana generation. In addition to the space requirements, dandelion automation has to be a lot more robust than endoflames, and it took more than a few attempts to get it working correctly. I do get it working eventually though, which results in a barrage of green blocks doing a little dance beneath the glass floor. I think that's pretty cool. With a copious amount of mana now free flowing around my base, I thought it would be a good idea to fight the Gaia Guardian a few more times, as my armor also requires a more than generous serving of Gaia spirits in order to be crafted. Well shit. It's finally time for extra botany. That's right folks, the living rock pedestal is finally being used to mash potatoes. I'm not really surprised that this is what it's used for, but that doesn't stop me from wondering why exactly I need mashed potatoes to craft magical ingots. Specifically, I need some photonium and shadowium? I don't know, in order to attempt a Gaia Guardian 3 fight. But I thought the Gaia Guardian only has 2 tiers, you exclaim aghast. Do not worry, normally it does, but we're playing with extra botany, which means it actually has 4. You may remember me talking about fun gameplay design and balancing during that one extra botany rant. Well, this is where these aspects are, for a lack of a better word, completely non-existent. Whoever was in charge of designing the Gaia Guardian 3 must have been doped up on enough carfentanil to kill the entire human population because this fight is just broken. So broken, in fact, I actually wait to complete it until after I'm obtaining the armor I'm going through this whole ordeal to get, because I don't think this thing would be possible otherwise. In order to make up for my lack of boss fighting, I decided it's about time I finished up the Dungeons of Arcana and killed Dramix and Parasecta, the invaders / residents / rulers of the dungeons. Oh yeah, if I haven't mentioned it before, Meatballcraft has lore and a lot of it too. It's just that I've opted not to explain it all because we'd be here longer than we are already, and let's be honest here, this video is way longer than I expected it to be. But I digress. My current objective is to actually locate the altars, which is rather difficult considering, you know, the entire dimension is a maze. As with all Divine RPG bosses, Dramix and Parasecta are incredibly well designed, with the mod authors taking into account all important aspects of the battle and ensuring there is no way to cheese it. Is what I would say if that was true, but it's not. Like, the amount of bullshit happening here is almost enough to get extra botany blushing. Dramix was a joke to fight, as even though he could turn invisible, which was strange, I could just hop on top of the light fixtures in the room and he couldn't reach me. And Parasecta, all I had to do was stand outside the boss room. I mean, come on, what are we even doing here? Anyway, the drops of the bosses are vital ingredients in making the GAIA Tesseract, which is something that has been alluded to by the percentage on the screen and the name of this part of the video. Basically, it lets me obtain the terrestrial crystal, but it's kind of a pain to craft. Ignoring boss drops from the Dungeons of Arcana, I also need a bunch of random items that aren't solely from Botania, which turns a quest for the terrestrial crystal into gating hell. One of these items requires an Ender Crafter, which while looking like it would be functioning like a combination crafter or infusion altar, works more similarly to the assembly table. The more, quote, Ender alternators I place around the crafter, the faster it will work. However, I do not get to use my Ender Crafter yet. In fact, I have to make a quick foray into the Twilight Forest for the sake of fiery ingots. This process is significantly expedited by my significant Botania progression, which makes the Naga and Lich fights a breeze. The Urgas wasn't nearly as easy though, and its fight could be best described as a process. On top of that, once I had actually killed it, I realized that it dropped a fraction of the fiery blood I needed to make the fiery ingots I need. Not wanting to spend all day climbing up towers and killing giant crying blimps, I go to plan B, Deep Mob Learning. Deep Mob Learning is this cool mod that allows you to simulate mob farms so you don't actually have to build one, and one of its models produces fiery ingots. The only problem is that making your first simulation chamber and loot fabricator requires that you progress through Woot and gather a laundry list of random items. Woot is a mod that I've never really played with before, and I'll get to my opinions on it in a little bit, but first I had to sort of come full circle and actually kill Smash, as a rare drop from him is required to make cursed organic matter, which I will need for Woot. Did I say rare drop? Sorry, I meant time to spend the next hour of your life killing the same boss over and over again drop. Sorry for the confusion. It's not like Smash is a difficult boss or anything. Not now that I can just stand on a ledge and beat him over the head with my sword, but it was still quite annoying to have to do. I haven't mentioned this, but my storage and crafting situation was beginning to get dire as I accumulated the hundreds upon hundreds of items that this mod pack has. So instead of finding a viable long-term solution for this though, I just built a storage scanner from RF Tools and slapped it next to my Actually Editions medium crates. Who needs 82 anyway? This cursed organic matter stuff is not easy to get apparently. Like, come on, I'm killing sea serpents as they flop around a lamb in some sort of sick dance. These are the antics this mod pack's got me up to at this point. I will admit though, there is something so satisfying about seeing all the pieces of a recipe like this one come together. even though I can't remember it without the help of GAIA. The stuff is dupable as well, which I think makes the grind a little more worth it, though I'm not really going to need that much. Oh wait, is this an even larger recipe that requires the crystal granitic matter? Yes it is. I'm getting GregTech flashbacks right now. Unlike GregTech, however, most of these are mob drops, so there's actually no problem getting my first Stygian iron ingots. To sort of minimize the amount of whoop crafting I will have to partake in, I elected to kill a ton of withers for their nether stars, as they can be used as an easier method of making Stygian iron, which is a relief because while not as grindy as a GregTech recipe, it was still horrible. The scale of the withers I'm fighting kind of outscales the old reliable tunnel method, so I moved my operation to the ends using an even cheesier method of killing them. Seriously, Mojang, what the hell is this? Hold on, I think it's time for my opinions of Woot. I don't have a massive amount to say because I have little experience with the mod, and to be honest, I'm sort of scared of it. It is an unholy combination of strange crafting recipes, a highly modular multi-block, and mob farming that just makes a little bit of piss trickle down my leg. I'm sort of predisposed to dislike it because of how obnoxious the factory was to set up, but the way it simulates the loot tables of mobs instead of just having a fixed amount of mobs with set drops is really cool. Anyway, this farm is set to kill creepers, which is sort of arbitrary, but gunpowder comes in useful sometimes. The actual purpose of this farm, however, is to produce tier 2 shards, which are needed to begin deep mob learning. While waiting for my Woot farm to produce the tier 2 shards, I decided it was a good idea to take a quick vacation to the Aether, as I need some of the blocks from that one Sun Guy's arena to craft necessary components for deep mob learning. Interestingly, in order to get to the Aether, I need wood from the Aether, as Meatballcraft has ruled that one must use a skyroot bucket to pour water on the glowstone. Not just any bucket will do. This has the possibility of introducing a catastrophic catch-22, but thankfully Meatballcraft also provides a way to craft skyroot planks, although this method does require me to dip my toes into astral sorcery, which if I'm going to be honest, was inevitable anyway. All I need is some illumination powder though, so I really just need to do that. I have to give it to astral sorcery. It really does not want to waste any of your time. I gotta admit, I never played the Aether way back in its prime. I only started playing modded Minecraft back in 2018, so I guess I don't really have the ability to appreciate the mod like others do. Anyway, getting back on track, I found a strange floating island inhabited by meatball rats, all of whom were quickly dispatched before I continued along my merry way. I also found an even stranger floating island with a bunch of crystals that I'm pretty sure will take another few episodes to become relevant. After I finished gallivanting around the clouds like a fool, I got down to business and found the first dungeon. Sadly, out of all the footage I didn't lose during the recording process, this footage of me defeating the cube guy is the only one I did. So here's me killing this mimic instead. I did manage to capture the other boss fights though, and I know you're really excited about watching sped up footage of me beating a Valkyrie to a pulp. So here it is. Yep. Once she was disposed of, I moved on to dealing with the Krenbingayuneth, the Sun Spirit, who is one of the most overkill names of all time, and who also has this annoying gimmick where you have to toss these floating ice balls into him in order to deal any damage. Like with the Guardian of Gaia though, enough enchanted golden apples makes pretty much any fight a waiting game, so eventually the wait was over and I was free to harvest some bricks from the dead Sun Spirit's dungeon, although floating red box would probably be a better name for it. With the Woot farm running and the Aether conquered, I could finally craft the simulation chamber. Sure, it's useless without the loot fabricator, but that isn't really completely true here, as pristine matter produced by the chamber prevents me from ever having to use Woot again. The loot fabricator didn't keep me waiting though. I crafted it up not even 10 minutes after making the simulation chamber. Now we're really in business. All I need for a limitless supply of fiery ingots is power, polymer clay, which has an incredibly cheap EMC cost, and a fully trained data model. Out of all of these, the data model was the most annoying to get, but that's only because I had to spend some time running around an underground maze in another dimension killing mutant cow people. What's funny is, in all the time it took to get the Terrasteel crystal, I actually managed to accumulate enough Terrasteel to craft the armor. That's 12 Endoflames and a Dandelion generating mana part-time for long enough to get 24 Terrasteel ingots. Like, that's a long time. What is this armor anyway, and why haven't I referred to it by name? That's because it is the Pleiades Combat Maid Dress. Yeah, say what you want, but in terms of Chapter 2 armor, pretty much nothing else can compete with it, especially combined with the fact that the Gaia Guardian 3 and 4 force you to wear armor from Botania or Extra Botany when fighting the bosses. Now, was this massive grind worth it? I mean, this took a good 40-something hours. I'd say, yeah. Compared to most other alternatives, it is much cheaper and doesn't require you to go insane like Mythmanite does. It also comes with a bunch of buffs and night vision during the night, so I'd say it is definitely a worthwhile investment. I'm not finished with Botania yet though. I haven't forgotten about the Terrasteel Crystal, even though it is pretty much null and void at this point. Sunk cost fallacy or something, I guess. As stated previously, I need the GAIA Tesseract in order to obtain the Terrasteel Crystal, and apparently that means I need my first modular machinery multi-block, because apparently some random ingredient needs dimension juice or some random shit like that. This basically means I have to temporarily shift my focus on a blood magic, where I'll just do some basic stuff with Demon Will that isn't worth explaining. Anyway, the Arcane Ashes I make with the Demon Will, which is really just another abstraction of dead mobs, are used to make some Fabric of Reality, which are a primary component of the multi-block, along with the fiery ingots I had been dead set on producing earlier. Modular machine multi-blocks sort of completely hinge on this ingot called Modularium, which has a really EMC intensive recipe of both dark and red matter. It's good that I don't need a boatload of the stuff, because even I'm rather well off, my EMC GDP would probably struggle in producing enough. You know what else is expensive? Modularium casings. Holy shit. Fluxed Electrum, and machine chassis, the fiery unguent from earlier. Really, the entire operation is just a giant sinkhole for my wealth. What's worse is that apparently I need to make an item called the multi-block manual before even being able to craft multi-block controllers, and I need to make an ME controller for that. I don't have anything against AE2, but I sort of wanted to avoid crafting the controller for as long as possible because I didn't really see a need to. Sadly, that's changed. It didn't really burn a massive hole in my wallet though. It was just really like the energy acceptor recipe from earlier, but with some skystone and diamond chipsets added into the fray. With the ME controller crafted, all I needed was a few magical doohickeys and I got my multi-block manual, which unlocked the construction of the mythical resource crucible. With GregTech multi-blocks, I could sort of understand why multi-blocks were the way they were, trying to be realistic and all. With Meatballcraft, that isn't really the case. What exactly is a mythical resource crucible anyway? I don't know, probably the thing that produces Red 40 and baby formula. Anyway, after I finished building it, I got distracted for a short bit as some new quests opened up and I ended up summoning a tower in the end. There's a bee in it, and that was pretty much it. As for the crucible though, I loaded it up with some random powders and it started making dimensional essence. Now that I'm making multi-blocks, it's probably a good idea to make an overworld mythical void miner. These are kind of like environmental tech ore miners, but they are unique to Meatballcraft and produce hard to get non-transmutable items, some of which are necessary for progression. Remember when I mined some uranium and made some living gold? Well, the uranium is needed for litherite, and both the litherite and living gold is needed to make the cases for the void miner. None of this is particularly cheap, especially with the insane matter cost tied to litherite production, but it's not prohibitively expensive, which allows me to bulk craft this stuff. Here's my incredibly sketchy compressed roar automation for compressed cobblestone. I hate it as much as you do, but it gets the job done. I'm waiting for my cobblestone to compress for the void miner casings. I may as well get some progress done on the Terrasteel Crystal front. Now that I have Dimension Essence, I just need to saute some cold iron in it to make Nether Sky Steel ingots. Now I just need to crush the Nether Sky Steel into dust and mix it with some Ender junk, and we've got ourselves an ever-watching eye. The last thing we needed for the GAIA Tesseract. Well, sort of. I still actually need to make a multi-block that can manufacture the GAIA Tesseract, but that's a simple matter. That I ignore for the sake of making the void miner instead. Wow, I definitely have my priorities straight. At least it's working. Don't worry though, here's some sped up footage of me putting together the GAIA altar. Look at all its pretty colors. Dear God, it's finally time to put together the GAIA Tesseract. Holy shit, that took forever, but what does it do? Simple. Teleports me to the top of the world when I'm in the Dungeons of Arcana. This allows me to access what is essentially its equivalent to the Nether Roof, which holds a very annoying dungeon filled with very angry dogs. After fighting tooth and nail through dog hell, I made it to the top of the dungeon, where I retrieved my Terrasteel Crystal.
Remember way back when I teased fighting the Gaia Guardian 3, then never did because they would have whooped my ass in the next town over? Well, I've got the armor, I've crafted the summon, now all I need is a weapon. I would have much preferred to use my trusty Tinker's Sword, but sadly, if it isn't vanilla or from Botania/Extra Botany, you can't bring it to the fight. Thus, I crafted Thundercaller, then super enchanted it into Thunder Fury, a cool sword that has this funny chain lightning ability that looks cool but doesn't do much. Weapon? Check. Armor? Check. Alright, it's go time. As stated previously, the Gaia Garden 3 is not exactly what I would call a fun or balanced fight. The first thing you might notice is that they now look like Steve. I don't really know what that's about, but okay. Secondly, you might notice these strange cube things. They do damage to you, kind of like how the Withering Clouds from the normal Gaia Guardian would. And now the boss is using its anime attack, which just sucks me into the center of the arena and does more damage than it should. Really, this fight is brilliant. I did manage to pull off a victory somehow though. I suspect it's probably something to do with my strict enchanted golden apple only diet. Defeating the Gaia Guardian 3 nets me some fun trinkets, but most importantly a medal for heroism, which is used to craft the Call of the Void, the summoning item for the Gaia Guardian 4. I think the fact that this recipe gives you 3 attempts at the boss fight speaks to how difficult it is. By difficult, I mean completely batshit insane. A few things to note before this battle. 1. The Gaia Guardian 4 is not the Gaia Guardian 4. Instead, it is the Hersher of the Void, which is something from Honkai Impact 3, a game brought to you by the same company that brought us Genshin Impact. 2. The fight is very similar to the Gaia Guardian 3's, but it seems as though the devs may have forgotten to, I don't even know, man, make the boss anything besides torture to battle? I attempted this boss twice and died both times. I just don't understand how it damages me. Like, how the fuck did I fall out of the world? Does it deal void damage or something? I will admit, I am very irked by this boss, and I might still be fuming over its existence. Why the hell is this monstrosity in this pack? Why can I only use weapons and armor that melt like cardboard in the way when fighting it? I don't know. So I've only got one attempt left before I have to grind back some more Calls of the Void, so I may as well propel it a little. It turns out pretty much all potions are considered vanilla, so I craft a bunch of healing potions. I choose instant health over regeneration because I realized the only real way to defeat this boss is to out-health them. There is just a certain amount of health you need to have at any given stage in the fight, and regeneration is too slow to maintain that amount. Despite that neat piece of theory crafting, I still died, so apparently this boss is just not happening yet. It's not like it's gating anything important anyway, so I think I just need to switch my priorities away from Botania. I could do with some more health though. For the longest time I've thought the main way of getting more hearts was through Spice of Life Carrot Edition. You know, eating more food types gets you more hearts. But I think I've been dead wrong this entire time. These heart capsules give me a ton more health than Spice of Life ever has. I've been missing out for years. Anyway, at a loss of what to do, I follow my heart questbook and decide to kill some Chiro moths in the Betweenlands. This will benefit me in no material way, but it will help me vent some frustration in the direction of strange swamp pests, and I get a cool barb weapon. So really, what's the harm in doing some interdimensional pest control? With my mind off my humiliating defeat by the hand of a shitty anime reference, I decide to focus on a new goal, as what's an expert pack progression without dividing everything you're doing into manageable bites for you to swallow? The new goal is a Tier 7 Draconic Energy Orb, which is as large as you can make one without needing Awakened Draconium, which is a little bit outside of the budget right now. Okay, I said that like the thousands of normal Draconium I need for the core is within my budget, but that might be a little more than an astronomical unit from the truth. However, unlike Awakened Draconium, this deficit can be rectified with only a little bit of grind. Deep Mob Evolution is going to be my weapon of mass destruction here, as its Ender Dragon model will produce Draconium dust. The only problem is I need to upgrade the model from faulty before I can plug it into a simulation chamber. The cost of upgrading it from faulty is only killing the Ender Dragon 6 times, so that actually doesn't sound that bad at all. Summoning that many dragons does require a good many end crystals though, so I made an Enderman data model to generate them for me. While waiting for my end crystals, in the meantime I summoned this divine RPG boss called the Watcher in the Nether. Now, as I've previously established, when the words Divine RPG, Nether, and Boss are put together, blood starts dripping from my monitor, my cat's fur falls off, and my back collapses under the weight of a million horrible game mechanics. This case was no different, but after a rather cinematic jump and slash maneuver, the boss was dead and I stole his eye. Now it's time to kill some dragons. While this process took a while, it was very mind-numbing, especially considering I was supposed to be fighting a challenging boss. Maybe I should be thankful that the dragon isn't getting harder though, that probably would have been worse. Anyway, once I had killed enough dragons to fill my base with their corpses, I plugged in the model and started generating Draconium. You might think that the several thousand Draconium I need for the energy core is the most expensive aspect of the project, but that actually isn't the case. Higher tier energy cores need 36 stabilizers to prevent them from shitting the bed. The problem here is that stabilizers are really expensive. Specifically, they require a lot of Divine RPG / Advent of Ascension ores, Ender IO capacitors / capacitor bindings, and Opinium cores. This rather unfortunate laundry list of goods will be way more difficult to obtain than the Draconium, so I'm gonna have to start somewhere. The RF Tools Builder is the first solution to the stabilizer problem. Contrary to its name, I do not use it for building, and instead use it for mining, as it is pretty much the best in-world miner the game has to offer. After giving it a filter and a defined area to mine, it will start gathering all the ores I need it to. RIP Buildcraft Quarry. May you rest in versions before RF tools. I'm going to ignore capacitor production for the moment because it sort of scares me and I'd rather have Opinium cores passive before I go down any Ender IO production rabbit holes. The first step in passiving Opinium cores is an idle production of red coal. This can be easily achieved by constructing an array of resonators and feeding them coal from some sort of EMC link. The actual automation process of the cores is as simple as programming a bunch of recipes into a crafter, mind you. The Opinium cores aren't automated all the way up their perfected tier, but I only need decent cores, so that doesn't really matter. During a routine trip to the nether roof, I happened upon a partly destroyed structure with a bunch of crystals dropped all over the ground. I don't know if this is cheating or not, but I collected them off the ground anyway. This probably won't become important later. Speaking of things that won't become important later, here's me crafting a demonically gargantuan drum. This is the last time it will be relevant, so say your goodbyes now. Higher tier Ender IO capacitor banks are made from a smorgasbord of materials from several mods. One of these materials, Empowered Diamantine, caught my eye as it is produced in the Actually Editions Empowerer. I've always avoided making Empowerer setups in other modpack playthroughs because I always found the recipes to be difficult to automate, but seeing as I'm probably going to need a lot of empowered resources, I've decided to passive the process. This is actually a simple matter of using an EMC link and a lot of filtering, so it turns out to be pretty easy to install into my base. That doesn't stop me from giving up halfway through though, and after getting halfway through, I decided to turn my attention to a much more important goal, making a floating island. Do I ever build anything on it? No. Does it ever become useful? No. Is this another useless tangent? No comment. The Shard of Laputa is a cool item from Botania that can be empowered by GAIA spirits and used to lift up large swaths of ground into the sky. I've always wanted to craft and use a maximum strength one in a survival world, so that's what I'm doing now. Wow, does it create lag. Damn! With my empowerers at least partially automated, I can move on to the next main automation milestone that really gates capacitor bank mass production, that being passive alloys. This is something I probably should have done before progressing through Botania, but it's better late than never, I guess. For this operation, I'm going to need the largest variation of EMC link, the compressed refined EMC link, which allows me to draw 56 different types of items from my EMC pool at once, which will be sorely needed due to the variety of metals and other miscellaneous objects alloys contain. The compressed refined EMC link needs some pretty strange items though, so I've got to kill the Nethenjaic Wither in the Nether. Unlike Divine RPG, Advent of Ascension had the decency not to make their Nether bosses blow ass, which is something I could appreciate, even if the Wither didn't drop the item I needed and I had to pull it out of the backlog. While waiting for the last parts of the compressed refined EMC link to process, I placed down the alloy smelters that will be responsible for producing the constituent alloys of the capacitor banks. To ease automation, each smelter outputs to a drawer that is part of a central bank, controlled by a drawer controller. This ensures that I can easily transport alloys into alloy smelters in case of two-step materials. The wait for the last parts actually becomes so boring, I begin doing random things around the base, like throwing bread into my elven portal. Apparently this isn't a good idea. You know what, I may as well be a little productive here. The alloy smelter system uses a very basic implementation of limiting item filters to stock each machine with the necessary materials for alloy production. While I can't currently source the materials as I'm still waiting for the EMC link, I can program the filters, which takes very little time, to my dismay. You know it's bad to decide that the best way to pass the time waiting is to go to another Divine RPG dimension. Thankfully, this one isn't a giant maze, just a giant plain of snow. Apparently, the main activity here is stealing snowflakes from the natives, which says a lot about the dimension, I think. So it turns out the only real goal in the snow plains, more formally known as Icica, is to raid this wizard tower thing. This requires a key which is crafted from gold infused with blood at a blood altar. Unlike the blood magic I was doing earlier, this isn't just will manipulation. No, we're gonna have to get out the sacrificial knives, the sigils. It's time for blood magic proper. First off, I craft the blood altar, which is going to be the center of my operation. It stores life essence, aka blood, and can be used to infuse items or send the essence into orbs, charging your blood network, which can power rituals. This isn't very important right now though. All I need to do is craft a sacrificial knife and start. You know what? I'm gonna let you leave where exactly I get blood from up to your imagination. Hold on, wait a second, the last piece of the compressed refined EMC link has come in, and there it is. All I need to do is install it into my alloy smelter automation and we'll be online. Anyway, pardon that interruption, I upgrade my blood altar with some blank runes up to tier 2, which allows me to make the key. With the key in hand, I broke down the front door to the nerd convention and proceeded to execute my typical cleanup procedure, which involves a lot of chain lightning and corpses. As for loot, I obtained the soul of the Grand Wizard, which exists, I guess. But hey, look at all this progress I've made with the Yo alloy smelter. It looks like the Draconic Energy Core also needs a fair share of nether stars in its construction, so I decided to move down my mob duplicator to a dedicated wither skeleton farm. By far, one of the most broken things in this pack is that there's this recipe for nether stars that just requires 2 wither skeleton skulls, some soul sand, and 1 piece of extraterrestrial matter from a simulation chamber. I mean, this recipe makes any sort of wither farm a giant waste of my time. After the alloy smelters had been running for a while, I finally completed my first capacitor bulk craft. What do you mean I only crafted 12? Look, we're running on a budget here. You just gotta trust the process. In all reality, the main factor holding back my capacitor production is infinity dust, as lighting fires on bedrock just isn't cutting it. Unlike usual, I actually opt for the long-term solution here, even though it might not be immediately useful. That solution would be using sag mills to duplicate the infinity dust. Well, it's not really duplication. It's just that when a block of infinity dust is grinded up, it has a chance of giving grains of infinity as a byproduct. Similarly, when a compressed block of infinity dust is ground up, it has a chance of giving an excess block of infinity dust. Because infinity dust can compress up to a double compressed block, you can generate a lot of infinity dust using the byproduct method over time. Sadly, the drop rates aren't great, so it can be hard to get the process started. In terms of automation, I'm pretty much set to handle the bulk of the stabilizer crafting, so now all there is to do is, well, craft the stabilizers. First up is crafting the capacitor banks. The main expense here actually comes from the infinity dust used in making constituent capacitors, not the large amount of alloys the capacitors require. I also need a few Wyvern energy cores for the actual core block of the energy orb, so I had to expend some of my hard-earned draconium on them, which actually set me back a lot more than I expected. Apparently draconic cores need a lot more draconium than I thought they did. There is so much micro-crafting in this process, holy shit! Finally, after our crafting process so convoluted and excessive that even Dream Master XXL would be jealous, I made the Draconic Energy Core stabilizers. Thankfully, the core block wasn't too expensive, cause otherwise I'm pretty sure my base would have imploded in on itself. Anyway, once that was crafted, I could begin construction of the orb itself, as I'm sure you already know that in all this time, my base managed to generate enough draconium to make it. And there we have it, a Tier 7 Draconic Energy Core. Will I fill it up? Probably not, but hey, it looks cool. Way back when obtaining the Pleiades armor was still a relevant goal, I mentioned the set can be super enchanted. Seeing how the Herrscher of Void kicked my ass, I think it'd be a good idea to start working towards getting it. Unfortunately, I have more than a few roadblocks to slam myself into before I get there. The first of these roadblocks, while less relevant to the overall goal, is still a roadblock nonetheless, which means it's finally time to conquer Thaumcraft. At least for the most part. As I stated earlier, Thaumcraft 6's research is quite comparable to wading through tar in your underwear, a necessary evil if you want to progress. However, this is one of those times where the Meatballcraft devs pull a small Deus Ex Machina and give us the power to cheese all research. When I said that, those familiar with the mod pack probably thought of the Vishroom variant that automatically unlocks everything as soon as you use it. While that is probably a better research cracking method than what I did, I don't think it's nearly as fun, and it also gives you a lot of warp, which is something I'm trying to mitigate at the moment. My aversion to warp isn't about the mobs or the negative effects, by the way. I'm already immune to any effect warp could give me, and the mobs couldn't kill me if they had all the time in the world. I'm actually just bothered by the way the fog that appears when the Eldritch dudes jump me glitch out the guide box and make it a harsh line between the lighter and darker areas. This isn't relevant right now, but you might see it on later in the video. Graphical errors aside, the method I'm using to gain research all comes back down to deep mob learning. I'm telling you, the more I play this pack, the more I value the time I put into unlocking the simulation chamber, because it's just incredible. Here's how my method works. The Mother Voidwalker data model produces these cool little items called Preserved Curiosity. Typically, these would rarely drop from Ember or when mined, but the Meatballcraft devs pulled that little trick I mentioned earlier and added them to the Mother Voidwalker loot table. When used, Preserved Curiosity grants me knowledge points. But here's the thing, they don't only grant me the knowledge I could already obtain with the Thermometer, they also grant me research table knowledge, allowing me to completely skip that god-awful minigame. The only caveat to this method is that the Mother Voidwalker is a hunter mob, meaning I need to level up my hunter skill before I can go killing them to level up my data model. The simple solution to this is building a new mob duplicator and siphoning some of the Wither Skeleton's farm essences in order to spawn lower level hunter mobs, which can be killed at lower levels. The mob of my choice for this operation was the Rammerhead, which is pretty much a brainless land shark from the desert. Anyway, while I let the model churn away at mass producing my knowledge in the background, it's time to solve a problem that's been haunting me for the majority of this pack: my inventory. It's funny, you'd expect a problem as large as inventory management to require some sort of convoluted series of horrendous crafting recipes to solve, but it really just requires some ender pearls and string. The handy bag is a simple item that expands your inventory by a lot. Well, technically it doesn't do anything by itself, but when memory cards are installed, it becomes capable of storing several inventories worth of items, which are accessed by a selection menu underneath the 2x2 crafting table. This is an especially welcome upgrade as Thaumcraft is sort of an inventory hog, and it's time I actually get started with some progression. As with everything Thaumcraft, the first step is to upgrade our alchemical abilities from Slag Cauldron to 21st Century Pollution Simulator. Technically, these two devices serve pretty different purposes, but that doesn't really matter here. Among other things, Thaumcraft is pretty well known for its flux system. Personally, I think it is one of the best pollution mechanics in modded Minecraft and is genuinely a massive motivator in mitigating the use of flux-producing machines. Like, compared to other pollution mechanics like, Pollution of the Realms, nothing really compares with the way Thaumcraft makes flux hard to clean up, easy to produce, and disastrous if left unchecked. That being said, placing the Thaumcraft equivalent of a coal plant in terms of pollution right inside my base was a bad idea. But hey, everyone makes mistakes. The Essentia Smelter is a furnace-like device that turns objects into their base aspects, which take form as Essentia, a colorful fluid that looks like it tastes really good if turned into a slushy. Essentia is used for a magical process called infusion, which is one of the most expensive and time-consuming methods of crafting any developer has ever come up with, which is something I can respect Asinor for. Another thing I can respect Asinor for is his appreciation for good aesthetics. As we all know, the infusion altar clears on that front. As I had mentioned when complaining about the combination crafter, the infusion altar works similarly. You place an item in the center and surround it with the items you want to merge with it on the exterior pedestals. However, the infusion altar comes pre-packaged with a bonus DLC that makes things much more interesting than a simple crafting recipe. Firstly, Essentia is required. That on its own isn't really all too interesting, but becomes so when mixed with the infusion altar's principal mechanic, stability. I'm not entirely sure of who hurt Asinor, or why he's obsessed with balancing every mechanic in his mod with some sort of catastrophic consequence, but it must have been bad. Infusion stability is influenced by a great deal of factors, which sort of push and pull at the crafting process like a game of tug-and-war. Firstly, there's the base stability of the recipe you're crafting. Recipes that are more expensive, or that Thaumcraft considers more taboo, will generally be less stable. Additionally, if you are to run out of Essentia during the crafting process, the stability will quickly decay. The stability of an altar setup can be improved by keeping it symmetric, but that only goes so far to preventing the bad shit happening. What types of bad shit? Unstable infusion altars have a nasty habit of blowing up the items you're crafting with, which sort of sucks considering infusion recipes are usually pretty expensive. On top of that, unstable altars release a fuck ton of flux, along with flux goo, and sometimes they summon lightning as well. To sum that all up, infusion crafting is like opening up Pandora's box and hoping that your carefully configured pile of rocks is stable enough to withstand the full force of a million plagues you just unleashed. I can't use the infusion altar without Essentia though, so I gotta start producing some of that, I guess. I really hope this doesn't cause any problems in the future. There are these rare and coveted items called primordial pearls that are notoriously difficult to obtain. Usually, obtaining such an item requires that you delve into the deepest depths of the void, or maybe even something more eldritch. Meatballcraft disagreed with this, however, and decided to just put a bunch of structures in the overworld that spawn a boss that drops one. Seeing as primordial pearls are required for advanced alchemical constructs, retrieving one was a good use of my time as my Essentia percolated. Hold on a second, what the hell is that thing hovering over my Essentia smeltery? Oh dear God, what is this and how can I get rid of it? A phrase now synonymous with Thaumcraft, the very uttering of this will actually send any member of r/feed the memes into a coma. As for what it is and the methods of getting rid of it, this lovely hole into oblivion is a flux rift, the most dire consequence of irresponsible flux management. Basically, if you allow enough flux to build up in a localized area, one of these bad boys will open up. The big problem with them is not only can they grow and eat blocks, which is already a nightmare as someone who likes to build, but they eventually will disappear, leaving in their stead a taint seed, which will slowly convert your base into a purple party palace for a bunch of parasites. The best way to get rid of these things is with a Causality Collapser, a magic grenade that will collapse the rift and get you some void seeds in the process. Sadly, Causality Collapsers are expensive and require infusion to be crafted, which sort of sucks seeing as I currently have a tear in spacetime ticking down till purple party hour. Regardless of the Causality Collapser's material obligations, I pursue one anyway as I really need to get rid of this thing. What's scary is, as I produce the Essentia required for the Collapser, I am fully aware that not only is the rift growing, but it's growing because I'm feeding it by producing the Essentia needed to stop it. God damn it, Azinor, why did you have to make this so stressful? This might surprise you, but my first attempt failed miserably. Apparently a few candles aren't good enough to prevent the infusion altar from deciding that it really wants to have a party with the one-eyed, one-horned flying purple people eaters. Well, there's my essentia wasted. Would it surprise you if I told you that the best way to mitigate instability in an infusion altar produces flux? No? Good, because infusion stabilizers do, in fact, produce flux. They also take a while to make, so they generally suck, but we're at the point where generally suck is an improvement. Turns out skulls are also a good stabilizer, so I pulled out a few from the Wither Skeleton farm and embellished my altar with them. Unfortunately, the Flux Rift had long since imploded by the time I managed to stabilize my altar and craft a Causality Collapser. But I wasn't going to go through all that suffering for nothing. Remember that floating island from earlier? The one with no purpose? Well, I guess it's about to have one. One that mostly consists of enduring the consequences of me dumping hundreds of items into a crucible and saturating the atmosphere with distorted magic. But hey, we got ourselves some Void Seeds. At the start of this part, I said Thaumcraft was only partially relevant to super enchanting my armor. That's because another mod happens to take the cake for the most relevant. That mod happens to be Abyssalcraft. The unfortunate reality of the situation is that I've got to go to the Abyss, and back again a good few times, and that means I'm probably going to go insane, as Meatballcraft integrated Abyssalcraft with Thaumcraft's warp mechanics. Ignoring mental health guidelines is nothing new to your friend Pun though, so it's now time to kill a bunch of shadow monsters for their gems and make them into the Oblivion Catalyst, which is sort of an overkill name to be honest. With the Oblivion Catalyst, I made a gateway key, which is my gateway to the Abyssal Wastelands, the first of the 4 layers of the Abyss. The second, the Dreadlands, requires that I essentially play a cheap replica of vanilla Minecraft's progression, requiring that I seek out a discolored stronghold and retrieve a red crystal from it. This stronghold is found exactly the same way the vanilla one is, and I'm sort of lost at what the point of this entire dimension is, to be honest. It wasn't even a particularly difficult dungeon, although that may be due to my slightly overkill armor. Regardless, I got the Dreadlands infused Power Stone in no time. This red lump of rock isn't the actual entrance to the Dreadlands, by the way, just a part of the means of getting there. I also need a better Necromonicon, as the current edition has about as much information as there is in 3 hours of scrolling TikTok. That is to say, basically none. Much to my disappointment, upgrading my Necronomicon involves using a Staff of Rending to extract Abyssal Wastelands essence from its locals. While this might sound interesting, it really just boils down to me pointing a stick at some zombies and clicking for as long as I need to, which is a good while. On top of requiring a new Necronomicon, I also need to perform a ritual in order to enter the Dreadlands, which means I'm going to have to stuff this thing in the old charger and hope it doesn't take too long, which is sort of wishing for a National Railroad transit system. It probably won't happen, and I find that very sad. This ritual, on top of requiring a bunch of random items, can also only be performed in the Abyssal Wastelands, which I guess makes sense, so I built up a quick ritual setup and activated the Ritual of the Sleeper. The Ritual of the Alarm Clock would be a more accurate name, as this ritual wakes up a dragon called Azora, continuing the Abyssal Wastelands tradition of roughly sticking to how the vanilla game rules. It does this very well, in fact. It's almost able to replicate how frustrating the Ender Dragon fight is. Something that I consider an impressive feat. Azora kind of threw a hissy fit after his death, which has strange implications concerning speaking past the grave, but that doesn't matter because the damn dragon didn't even drop the key to the next lair. No. He dropped his eye, which must be combined with my pre-existing key at the price of a large amount of potential energy. Well, I guess it's back down to the waiting pits. Should I make a better PE generation? Yeah, but I'm not going to in this chapter. I think it'll only really become a problem when I try to get the Necrombi later on. See? My battery isn't that horrible. After performing the ritual, I obtained Azora's dreaded gateway key and a block rendering exception, which is really just a great deal if you ask me. And here we are. Well, I wouldn't want to have a vacation here? Guess it's time to shove myself into the classic gameplay loop of pointing a stick at a zombie and draining their essence. I don't know if you noticed it in that last clip, but there was this little bar with a brain on top in the upper left hand of my screen. That is my sanity meter. Notice how it's completely full? Well, I have. That means it's time to break my brain beyond repair because at this point it's pretty much sludge anyway. The first step in what I like to call the final lobotomy, although some thaumaturgic purists recognize it as the opening of the eye, is an augment to my gauntlet into a state where it can manipulate impetus. First off though, I need a better gauntlet as my simple caster's gauntlet would probably explode under the magical pressure I'm about to put it through. As with everything Thaumcraft, this is a very flux-heavy process, and for once I decide that it'd probably be a good idea if I don't open another one of the universe's ass cracks in my base. Earlier I said flux is hard to clean up. This holds pretty true the entire game unless you have a creative flux sponge, which is currently out of reach. What we do have is the flux condenser, a horribly inefficient, overly expensive piece of shit. It is my only option though, so I'm gonna have to use it. Basically, it uses these condenser things you place on top of it to soak in flux from the surrounding environment and uses essentia to turn it into Vidium essentia. Obviously, Vidium essentia could not be used in this process, as that would be far too cheap. The big problem with flux condensers, though, stems from the fact that parts of the collection lattice clog and cannot be unclogged, meaning you basically have to break the device down and make new parts whenever a part of the lattice needs to be replaced. The condenser lattices aren't cheap, so I just don't bother replacing them and just kind of let the condenser be as I continue working on my new Thaumium gauntlet. Quick update on that useless floating island in the middle of nowhere. It now has a small taint problem. And a really, really big rift. It also seems as though I need a few more research points before I can unlock the impetus conductor. Better consume some mass-produced precious relics. Yeah. And there we go, an impetus conductor attached to a Thaumium gauntlet. I'd like to note that neither of these items are from Thaumcraft. Thaumcraft 6 was left incomplete by Azinor several years ago, and an add-on called Thaumic Augmentation has pretty much become the ad hoc supplier of late-game progression. You see, a gauntlet with an impetus conductor allows me to harness the energy, or maybe the not energy, from rifts and use it to do things like open up different rifts. These are not the same. Sure, they are both purple cracks in reality, but I can assure you, they are not the same thing. The rift I enter conveniently lets out directly next to my target, the giant fortress you see before you. Inspired by Thaumcraft 4's late-game dungeon, this fortress is basically a combination of a maze, several large chambers, and a boss fight arena. Given my armor, it was trivial to clear it out. And the tattered scroll I received as compensation for sieging this place isn't even currently useful, which kinda makes me reconsider even bothering to do stuff like this. Wait a second, wasn't I in the middle of progressing through Abyssalcraft? What the hell was that little side quest about? Well, it turns out you need a lot of potential energy to summon the boss of the Dreadlands, and I mean a lot, so I have to pass the time doing other things, like learning how to fly. This isn't as easy as flapping my arms around and praying, as I need a few niche things, the first of which, and the most expensive, being Lumium Singularities. Technically, I don't need them, but I don't feel like running around for several hours trying to find a King Charger, so crafting its spawner with a relatively cheap metal doesn't sound like a bad idea. Sadly, the cheapness of the metal does not impact the speed at which it is produced, so I've got more than a bit of time to kill before the singularities are ready. All items that allow flight in Meatballcraft will at some point require the charger ring to craft. Besides the King Chargers I've already mentioned, the ring also needs some Charger large plates, which are made by molding molten Charger meat in a smeltery and one of those weird animal rings from Extra Utilities, which is really just a fetch quest. Getting hold of the Charger meat was actually harder than I had expected. Apparently 6 large plates is larger than I thought. Again, the mob duplicator comes to the rescue. Alright, to enter Omathal, the third layer of the Abyss, I need to craft an altar of Chagaroth. This is a 2-block mini multi-block that summons a dungeon with the boss I need to fight it in. Aside from the massive amount of requisite PE the rituals for crafting the top and bottom blocks require, I also need to purify some Dreadium. For that, I craft the Transmutator and burn up some Corallium Pearls to provide the fuel for the purification. At the same time, I've gathered everything I need for the Charger Ring besides the souls of the King Chargers, so we're making good progress on that front. What isn't making good progress is the total amount of PE in my Necronomicon, so I guess it's time to get my hands dirty. Just another day of appreciating my armor. After that small amount of juicing, I'm able to begin crafting the top of the Chagaroth altar. Like the Azora ritual, it must be performed in the dimension I'm trying to progress through, which means we are getting ourselves a fancy red altar. I really appreciate this pig's service in helping me progress. It was a real one. Actually, maybe I really should try to speed up my PE production. I mean, sure, the Lumium for the Charger Ring isn't even halfway to the lofty how many thousand I need, but sitting around and waiting for a bunch of mobs to die in a pit isn't really my idea of a good time. Apparently, I can use my Eldritch neighbors to sculpt some totems for me that have the ability to charge up my book. Well, if I'm gonna force Eldritch monsters to build things, I may as well do so on the ever so reliable floating garbage island. As you can probably tell from the footage, this is what some may call a bad idea. Not only do the monsters want to tear me limb from limb, but their stupid tower charges my buck even slower than my shadowy death pit. Well, back to the bottom of the world, I guess. In the meantime, I craft the Quantum Compressor, which is the machine responsible for turning my Lumium into extremely expensive one-dimensional trinket. Apparently, it's sort of taboo to use this machine as opposed to its custom multi-block counterpart, but I didn't feel like expending a bunch of resources on that, so I'll settle with a lag machine for now. So, it turns out blood magic just got relevant again. Yeah, something about the Deep Dark and a Phantom Bridge reagent. Unlike last time I played around with Will, which was such an easy process it was demoted to less than a sentence, this time I've got to get a little bit more. To ease this process into the can be expected to be complete in a reasonable amount of time zone, I crafted a sentient sword which allows me to fill up Tartaric gems, soul batteries, with demon will. Problem is, the amount of will I need is sort of excessive, so I'm going to have to go through this obnoxious process of crafting larger and larger Tartaric gems, which need a nearly fully filled gem of the highest available tier to fuel the crafting process, and an empty gem of the same tier to actually be turned into the next one. This means I need an absolutely abhorrent quantity of this stuff. Good thing my floating death island comes pre-stocked with a variety of eldritch horrors for my reaping pleasure. Blood magic can go on hold for now though, my Necronomicon is finally filled up. Sorry Mr. Pig, but you're currently the only thing gating me from whacking some eldritch gods in the face, and that's not an opportunity you can just pass up on. Now just to assemble the altar underground in the Dreadlands Mountains biome and hope that it works. Yep, we've got the edgy text and everything. You'd think some sort of Eldritch Conqueror deity would have better security. And yep, he's dead. And his heads are spinning. This is all very necessary, I presume. Just like collecting the legendary treasure of the Dreadlands. Look at this A-grade FDA-certified pristine piece of dirt. Damn. The funny thing is, now that I have the key to Umathal, I can just sort of walk up to its boss and dispose of him. There's no strange gating, dungeoning, summoning altars, distorted replicas of vanilla progression. Nope. Just a trek to 0-0. So after I cleaned up Jahazar's atrium a little, I paid him a visit and gave him a one-time ticket to the furthest ring, which he did admittingly need a little convincing to accept. By far the most annoying aspect of this fight was his exploding corpse interrupting my meatball munch times. But that's it. Abyssalcraft conquered. Well, there is another lair, but I'd rather not have to go there until it is very much necessary. In the meantime, I'm going to kill these strange bird dudes in the end. You would not believe what incredibly balanced mod added these guys in. Honestly, I'm glad I found out you could just hide in one of the end pillars, because otherwise this fight would have been a pain in the ass. Apparently, I need to go to the final lair of the Abyss a little sooner than expected. Fortunately, this can easily be achieved by throwing myself off of one of Umathal's floating islands. This will send me to the Dark Realm, which is solely inhabited by shadow monsters and wizards, although I'm pretty sure the wizards are an invasive species. Regardless, I'm here to retrieve the Alderanary, which I have reason to suspect might be the heart of the Abyss. Anyway, it'll come in handy later, so it's good to have in my back pocket. And by back pocket, I mean the eternal depth of my RF tool storage system, but that's not important. Of every non-divine RPG dimension I've progressed through so far, the Erebus is my least favorite. Don't get me wrong, it's a very well done mod and is honestly really polished, but I just don't like bugs. The goal here is to try and get the entire dimension done as fast as possible, then never visit it again. Step 1, retrieve an antlion queen egg. This thing is our main objective as it is gating the Unfathomable Breaker, which is a custom item used to enter some dungeon in the deep dark. Conveniently, entering the Erebus was not gated in any meaningful way, so all I had to do was throw some items on an offering item then open up the portal. The Antlion Temple was actually located really close to my entrance point, and that's probably the hardest part of the entire process. From there, all I had to do was go back to my old pest control routes and gather some items that dropped from bugs around the temple. Looks like it's boss time. It also looks like these bugs haven't yet evolved to withstand the force of a magical lightning sword. Got my egg though. I also killed the Tarantula Broodmother, as I really don't want to have to come back here at some point, and I think it might be important later on. In the time it takes before the last of my Lumium cooks up, I decide to upgrade my numismatic dynamos to Endurium. I don't want to say my power grid is struggling, because then I'll have to admit that I probably should be using another method of energy generation, so instead I'm just going to try and cover up the problem with upgrades, which is something any self-respecting engineer should be willing to do. And it looks like it's compression time. Flight, here we come! In retrospect, I should have probably automated this process. While at some point I entertained the creation of 2 singularities, that was before I remembered the holy grail that is the mob duplicator can actually clone up my King Charger. Man, I'm so glad I remembered that. Alright, here's the King Charger, and here's his new relatives. Once they're all capped up, I use their entrapped souls to make myself a shiny new Charger ring, which only needs to be embellished with some Botania trinkets before it can fly. Oh wait, I've already completed Botania. Is the Flugel Tiara the best choice for flight in the pack? Nope. Far from it, in fact. Actually, It's probably the worst method of creative flight, as not only does it consume mana, but it has limited flight time and has a hard to control dashing ability. This doesn't stop it from looking really fucking cool though, especially once I rename it and reclaim the one. Looks like it's time for some more blood magic. The last thing I need to get into the deep dark is that damned Phantom Bridge reagent, and I need to pull out all the stops to get it. First off, upgrading my Tartaric gems wouldn't be a bad idea. For the next tier of Tartaric gem, I will need some weak blood shards, meaning I need to make a bound blade. This weapon will drain life essence from my blood network and in return will give mobs a chance of dropping blood shards. After crafting some binding reagent, I need to use an alchemical array to fuse it into a sword. I'd like to know how much I love how alchemical arrays look. Like seriously, why does the mod have a permanent version of one or something? Weak blood shards also unlock the next tier of Blood Altar, which I proceed to construct slightly further from my base than the original. I sort of wish they were less awkward to integrate into my base, but maybe I'm just not considering a good way to implement one. I don't know. Actually, speaking of awkward, you may have noticed I've been continually taking damage as I've been building the altar. That's because I forgot to turn off my bloodbound blade, allowing it to eat through all the blood on my network, and now it's on to eating me. Yeah, this one actually had me confused for a little bit, to be honest. Along with being able to handle more advanced recipes, expanding a blood altar also comes with the benefit of accepting more upgrade runes. These bad boys replace what would have otherwise been blank runes and can increase altar capacity, speed, transfer rates with my blood network, among other things. As you can see here, I'd like to use my altar's upgrade capacity as much as possible. This is mainly because of a certain recipe I have in mind. You see, the sentient sword can be super enchanted to do more damage, and seeing as it is currently doing about as much damage as an iron sword and I need over 4,000 demon will, upgrades are definitely required. The great thing is, all I have to do is let my sword sit in a massive pool of blood for a little bit. By a little bit, I actually mean about 10 minutes, but I guess that's what happens when you prioritize capacity over speed. Regardless, with my obtaining of the Soul Eater, I can finally get the Phantom Bridge reagent without going more insane than I already have. After more than a little bit of grind, the reagent is finally mine, and the funniest part is the recipe only required obsidian, stone, and some soul sand. It's so strange that something so cheap can be so difficult to get. After its production, I also made another, less notable reagent, which when combined with the Phantom Bridge reagent, some world threads, and compressed cobblestone, yields the portal to the deep dark. I can't go there yet though. Well, okay, I can, but I'm not going to. Not without the unfathomable breaker. Otherwise, there would really be no point in going down there, as the item I need can only be locked within some stupid dungeon. I'm not gonna keep you waiting long though. I've already gotten the antlion egg, and now I just need to kill some more of the floppy fish guys from back in the Botania days. I feel bad for them, but hey, I need their fins. I also need to kill some annoying nether spiders, which I feel significantly less bad about. Using the spider's drops, I can compress the mana runes I need to make the breaker. From there, I surround my antlion egg with the compressed runes, and there we go. One unfathomable breaker. It's time to go to the deep dark. Much like the Erebus, I plan to pretty much clear out the deep dark objectives in one fell swoop while I'm down there. So once I enter... Wait, this isn't the deep dark. This is what you might be saying if you don't know about the original extra utilities to Deep Dark, the one that existed before the vanilla one. If you did know that, I'm just wasting your time. Anyway, time to unfathomably break, and the dungeon is filled with centipedes. Great, that's just great. Once the pest problem was cleared up though, I obtained the culmination of all this progress. The demonic mana stone. This is the last major piece of the puzzle I began putting together back when I first obtained the Pleiades armor. Before actually putting the puzzle together though, I may as well kill this dude for his blue ingot. Like, he's not using it and I just happen to be in the deep dark. I think this will become important later. Maybe. Now it's time for the puzzle. Step 1 of assembly, make a fully upgraded Necronomicon. Well, back to pointing my stick at some more undead. Once that operation was done, I went back to the Betweenlands, which has been feeling neglected recently. All I needed was some Undying Embers though, so I pretty much bounced as soon as I killed the salamander dudes I summoned by launching lightning everywhere. Now as for the fun step, gathering random stuff. The first of this random stuff is the Alumnite Fork, which can be retrieved from a scrapboxinator processing scrap boxes. After setting up my automatic loot box machine, I let it idle for a bit and eventually puked up an Alumnite Fork. The final item I need is a fish. Sadly, it could not be fished up from an ocean. No. Instead, this coral guy called Corallus drops it. The problem here is that just like that one time I had to fight Smash like 20 times, the fish's drop chance is horrible. Also like Smash though, the summon was really cheap, so it was just sort of tedious to get. This ritual must be performed in the Dark Realm, and that means I need Exathium bricks to make an altar. Exathium bricks are a really annoying craft, so here's a pun-endorsed method to avoid having to do so. Step 1. You know the altar in Jahazar's Goon Cave? It should be below the throne room. Form it. Next, break the formed altar blocks. Notice how it drops Exatham bricks? Pretty cool, right? Move those down to the Dark Realm, pray you don't place any wrong, and boom, you got yourself a completely free Dark Realm altar. With that, I can craft the Undead Callstone, whose clip I will actually play in real time because of how difficult it was to obtain. It ain't over yet though. Using the Undead Callstone unleashes an unfathomable army of nightmares I have to fight, led by the Shade of the Meatball Man. Before plunging into battle though, I'm going to grab the 4 marks of gluttony contained within the structure, as those are the items that will actually allow me to upgrade my armor. Actually, I'm just going to upgrade my armor while I'm at it too. It's not like I can't press the summon button on the structure that will summon back the Shade of the Meatball Man. So in a long-awaited montage, I finally super enchant my armor. And now I guess it's time to whoop some ass. And after whacking the Meatball Shade guy enough times over the head, he finally died, leaving behind a buck that I can only assume is badly written fanfiction or something. This conclusion comes from the fact that the book activates hard mode, which is obviously a way for the Meatballkin to power trip over themselves and land at my feet, because now I have access to some unique items that I won't bother gathering until after this episode. What the hell? As I see it, Meatballcraft has 2 major ways to progress: exploration and automation. Both are interconnected, of course, but at the end of the day, if you're not progressing in one, you're progressing in the other. As you might have noticed, you are about an hour and 30 minutes into this video, and I've automated relatively few things when compared to how much I've explored. It's time to rectify that. There are 2 camps when it comes to mystical agriculture: those who don't like it because it's overpowered, and those who do because it's overpowered. The only constant between these 2 groups is that they both admit it's overpowered, and that means it's perfect for my automation purposes. I'm not some hobo though, so I'm going to take a few steps in ensuring I get the best possible results from my automation attempts. Before that though, I need to make a few Emberstone crystals. This process requires a squeezer from Integrated Dynamics, which is another one of those items that is technically gated past itself. Thankfully, a little bit of Tinker's Junk goes a long way, so I've got that squeezer in no time. The Emberstone crystals produced from squeezing Emberstone are the main component in mystical agriculture seeds. But in classic Meatballcraft fashion, it's time to completely change my main objective, because that's what this pack is all about, apparently. As you might recall, uranium is a resource I need in bulk quantities for the production of litherite, which is used in making void miners. Well, I'm tired of mass-producing uranium in my Tinker's smeltery, as it yields far from the best result I can get out of the ore. This little device here is an induction smelter augmented with a pyro concentrator. When fed blazing pyrotheum, rich slag, and uranium ore, it gives a 4 times yield, which as far as I know is the best possible yield I can get from an ore. The question of the day is, to what extent will mass-producing uranium irradiate my base? After opening up a few fortune cookies and shaking my magic 8-ball, the current most reliable answer is not at all. I know I have radiation on, so maybe the threshold for radiation poisoning is higher than I thought. I'm not complaining though. With all this uranium, I go ahead and craft a stack of litherite, which should be more than enough to make the 24 structure frame tier 1s for my tier 1 void miner. The size here. I'm making a void ore miner, not a mythical void ore miner. Basically, the non-mythical versions are from the mod Environmental Tech, and not added in by Meatballcraft through modular machines. The default void ore miners differ in that they don't have special loot pools, and instead mine ore from a rather large loot table of ores that are generated in the overworld and the nether. Truth is, Project E almost completely negates any purpose void ore miners actually have, especially lower tiered ones, but they still have some use cases. The most important is producing higher tiered crystals along with litherite. No more uranium processing for me. In addition, they also produce some weird edge case ores that don't have EMC or a mystical agricultural crop, which will become useful later on in the next part. Back before I got sidetracked by the void ore miner, I said that there are steps I need to partake in before I get down to mystical agriculture. Well, there's really just one step, and that would be obtaining an agricultural queen. You see, mystical agriculture crops have 3 traits, each ranked from 0 to 10, with 10 being the best the trait can be. I don't remember what exactly the traits are because I never cared too much about them specifically. All you really need to know is 10-10-10 crops grow faster and produce more essence when harvested. Typically, you obtain 10-10-10 crops by the tedious process of crossbreeding plants. I've never been a big fan of plant crossbreeding, but I do happen to be a big fan of bee crossbreeding, and there just so happens to be a way to make a plant seeds into its fully upgraded 10-10-10 version, and that would be by combining the plant with the agricultural queen's combs. In the last episode, I did some rudimentary bee breeding to get a noble queen, but compared to what's about to happen, that was a drop in the ocean. I mean, even drawing a comparison at all seems off. I'd like to note I've never actually done large-scale forestry bee breeding before, so maybe there's fun in the novelty of the experience, but that doesn't fully explain why people dislike it so much, as this was actually one of my favorite parts of progressing through Chapter 2. Any good apiarist knows that a good bee breeding area is required if they want to be taken seriously whatsoever, so step 1 would be building one. With the help of Botania's World Shaper Sextant, making a nice circle for the base of the design was trivial, so I could get down to building it. I know I don't really talk about building things that much in these videos, but it's actually my favorite part of the game. It's just sort of strange to narrate on, so I find it difficult to wedge building segments in, especially with the amount of time it takes to build anything. I don't think any of y'all wanted to see a 60 times speed clip of me building a hallway or something. Anyway, with the lone platform constructed, I can get started on the first step of advanced bee breeding. DNA automation. Like everything I do, I technically don't have to do this until later, but as I always say, it's better to have a backlog of stuff when you don't need it than have none of the stuff when you do. Anyway, my DNA automation follows the BEE method, that being produce a lot of bees, extract their DNA, and earn your way to hell because you just made an affront to God. This industrial apiary fulfills the first step, producing wintry drones. Before extracting any DNA though, these guys might come in useful as breeding stock, so I keep some around. It turns out upgrades for industrial apiaries are like really cheap, so I make a bunch of speed upgrades to get the bees really working at it. There are actually two types of speed upgrades, one affecting lifespan and the other production rate. I'm going with lifespan as I couldn't care less about that production rate of wintry combs. To prevent any genetic mishaps, I avoid using Gendustry's pre-packaged automation upgrades, opting to use Ender IO conduits with limited item filters instead. Trust me, this is the best way for me to do this. Better than one industrial apiary? 2? Or maybe even 3? A major tenet of the BEE method is dedication to mass production. After all, I also set up this centrifugal separator to help process the combs. I know I said I don't care about them, but it is sort of a waste to let them build up without doing anything to them. Sometimes people make mistakes. Here I am breeding a rocky princess with a wintry drone without any sort of backup rocky bees or anything. I make a fair few mistakes during the bee breeding process, and this is one of the bigger ones, as I essentially destroyed an entire trait here. Sure, I got a common queen now, but notice that automation upgrade? I let it run wild with my bees, and I sort of end up cultivating a strange strain of bees with a bunch of mishmash traits. My number one tip in forestry breeding is to be careful when introducing a new species trait to a bee that currently has a homozygous genotype, as if you introduce yet another new species trait, you risk completely overriding your original species. Basically, before trying to crossbreed strains, have multiple homozygous drones you can either recreate a princess with or reintroduce to the strain, and then you can get the princesses from the crossbreed. I don't know if any of what I'm actually said just made sense, or actually was even correct at all, but I hope it helps someone out. Changing topic real fast, I have one gripe with supersymmetry. For some odd reason, it disabled RFTool's elevators whilst having the mod installed. This is a travesty in my eyes and should be rectified at once. In the meantime, I'll install an elevator over here in Meatballcraft. I mean, this is just so cool. I may or may not have spent an exorbitant amount of time going up and down on this thing. While I was busy going up and down on a 3x3 platform of factory blocks, my noble bees from last episode were busy breeding up a new strain, the Majestic Bee. This is the first step towards the Agricultural Queen, with the next step being the Imperial Queen, which is a combination of a Majestic Bee and a Noble Bee. You might notice I'm using a Mutatron here, but I didn't earlier on when breeding bees. Like with introducing new strains, I only use the Mutatron if I have drones or princesses in excess of the species I'm breeding. Pretty much every bee is eventually used in more than one way, and it would suck if I destroyed a strain I'll eventually need. A learned viewer with a keen eye might also notice my Imperial Queen is ignoble. Remember how I said I've never actually bred bees to this extent before? Well, for the first while, I foolishly used both ignoble and pristine bees, as I sort of pushed the idea of genetic decay into the back of my head. This causes surprisingly few problems, as by the time my princesses stopped giving out new princesses, which is the problem with ignoble strains. I have enough drones of said strain, I can just convert a pristine princess into a princess of the strain. Now that I'm getting serious about bee breeding, it's time I actually set up a lab to do it all in. What we got here is an array of industrial apiaries dedicated to breeding up new strains and converting pristine princesses. That purple fluid running through that cable, that's the DNA from the BEE method. The process of obtaining the DNA was actually rated R by the MPA, so I can't show it here, but I'll say there's no mystery to why the second E in the BEE method stands for what it does. Speaking of not actually showing things on screen, sorry to disappoint those who were excited about the bee breeding process, but I am not going to be explaining every component of the agricultural bee. As it turns out, it's sort of a process to obtain, and there are simply too many component species for me to explain them all. It's not time to fret about that yet, though. First, I've got to gather a bunch of pristine breeding stock as my dumbass finally discovered the woes of genetic decay. Yep, time to frolic in a field with a scoop for half an hour. Alright, now it is time to fret, because you're about to witness the worst bee breeding montage ever made. I hope you're ready to wet yourself, because y'all finna get real familiar with the BEE method. For being what some may call a grindy process, I actually really enjoyed obtaining the agricultural queen. The only problem is that a bee species is only one of their 13 total traits, and in all honesty, my agricultural queen's genetics are so horrible that the only reason it is currently useful is because it's a rare species. It works slowly, can't tolerate shit, and is generally a low-quality bee. Thankfully, gendistry allows you to extract and manipulate traits from bees. This is just as a grindy process as bee breeding is, so I'm just going to show a little bit of complimentary sped up footage of me trying to extract the bee species trait. Basically, doing this instead of imprinting good traits onto a princess offers me more control over the exact traits of the strain, as I can put traits together in a gene template. For example, imprinting the fast trait onto an agricultural princess, something I currently only have one of and takes a while to get more of, that has some good traits is less efficient than just making a gene template with the species and the good traits than putting it on any old species. Now that I've got bees that actually produce desirable combs, it's time to start allowing them to actually produce things. Following my earlier designs for industrial apiary automation, I use Ender.io conduits to ensure that no forbidden genetic shenanigans are taking place and to retrieve any produced combs and other goods. Technically, I could only use one conduit and it would be much more space efficient with this design, but right now my bees are slow enough where efficiency losses don't really matter. A big problem with lower tier void miners is that they're really slow. Like, not even snail pace. Think more like, I don't even know to be honest, they're just that slow. They also lack the ability to be upgraded. To remedy this, I upgrade my Void Ore Miner to Tier 2 using all my Litherite and Rhodium crystals. Its Tier 1 Incarnation had mined up while I was busy breeding up a storm in my bee area. The Structure Frames Tier 2 also require some other strange trinkets like gold plates and redstone circuitry from Project Red, but that's all just a matter of EMC and thus a non-issue. Also, when I say upgrades, there are upgrade slots available in higher tiers of Void Ore Miners, so you can upgrade the tier of lower Void ore miners obviously, but you can't necessarily give them like speed augments, energy augments, etc. I know this might be strange, but I decided to make a whole new tier 1 controller and upgrade it to tier 2 instead of upgrading my pre-existing controller. I actually do this with all parts of the miner. My philosophy here is that this will allow me to have several running in parallel later on, and allow me to convert some leftover parts of the lower tiers into void resource miners, which have kind of a strange loot table that I could potentially benefit from. A phone call just came in from the quest book. Apparently there's this bee that has a special speed trait that is faster than all the rest. This would be the Robot Queen, who has the speed of robotic. I think at this point we're a good few degrees of separation from what I could consider even remotely realistic bees, but that doesn't matter. The fact is, I'm going to need to do another massive breeding session. This time, I'm not going to blast your eyes with a 20 times sped up montage, as I feel like y'all pretty much get what I'm doing at this point. Even with the Robot Queen obtained, I still need to isolate the robotic speed trait. I didn't mention this before, but trait isolation has to be the only mechanic in bee breeding I genuinely dislike. Basically, you put one of your bees, which is hopefully a drone, into a genetic sampler, and it will randomly pull one trait off the bee and onto a bee sample. The problem with this is the whole randomly part. Basically, every single time I get some new drones with the trait I'd like to isolate, I end up betting on black every time and losing everything. Like, I could rarely care less about territory average and lifespan short. I've got like a million of those traits. I do eventually manage to isolate the trait, however, which means it's finally time to actually start Mystical Agriculture. Mystical Agriculture is a mod that almost fully revolves around the production and enhancement of various essences. Beginning with Inferium, you need to use special upgrade crystals to make the essences better, and thus capable of crafting more expensive crops. These crystals, known as infusion crystals, kind of suck though and have durability, which makes them 1. Expendable, and 2. Obnoxious to craft with because they have NBT. There is, however, a Master Infusion Crystal that doesn't have any of these problems and can upgrade or downgrade any tier of essence. Naturally, I'm going to try and get one of those even before wasting any time making crops. Sorta got a head start on essence production because of my Wither Skeleton farm, so I can already upgrade my Inferium up to tier 2. The buffer of the farm won't last forever though, as the Inferium cost of higher tier essences gets absurd kind of fast, but it should be enough to get myself a Master Infusion Crystal. Just like how higher tier essences require all preceding tiers to be produced, so do Infusion Crystals, which means I've also got to make a bunch of those. I just love how they have durability and are near impossible to craft with. It makes me feel all warm and fuzzy inside. Although that might be all the stupid crystals taking up my inventory. They aren't even difficult to craft, and that's with Meatballcraft's recipe modifications. Why do I have 46 Supremium Essence, not to be confused with the blue Superium Essence I just crafted, in my inventory? I shouldn't even be able to craft that. Well, it turns out that bosses dropped this stuff and I killed a ton of withers back when I was grinding out nether stars in the end. Anyway, this basically makes the rest of this process trivial, as now that I have the Supremium Infusion Crystal, I can just use the Supremium Essence I already have to basically skip any of the horrible, you need to upgrade several thousand Inferium Essence into a single speck of red dust grind that would have been otherwise necessary. And now for the Master Infusion Crystal. Woo! Seeing that the Master Infusion Crystal doesn't have durability, I can now use it in an RF Tools crafter to automatically compress all the essence produced by my Wither Skeleton farm. The essence throughput on my Wither Skeleton farm is actually horrible though, so I decided to finally build a y=0 mob farm that isn't just a pit with a mob crusher and some shadowy dirt. I think it works pretty well, and it also doesn't look completely horrible, which is a plus. I don't know if you remember, but a good while ago I automated actually additions and powerers. The truth is, that was a complete lie. They are far from automated and are just sort of linked together. In order to properly automate them, I'm going to need another compressed refined EMC link, and for that I need demon hearts or something. Anyway, the best way to get demon hearts is through farming the Netherjaic Wither through deep mob learning. So now I need to actually summon one. This is a problem as I need flammable dust, which is a rare drop from withers. The nether roof was never the same after this. With that flammable dust, I could obtain a Netherjaic Callstone from a Netherjaic Beast, which is used to make the Netherjaic Wither data model. But guess what? This is DML. I need to upgrade the data model, which means it's time to grind out some more withers for flammable dust. It turns out I could have just been using my mob duplicator to spawn Netherjaic Beasts, which have a data model for flammable dusts themselves, so maybe I wasted some time. But hey, I did get some nether stars out of this. Now that I've got all the flammable dust, I just gotta kill a bunch of Netherjaic Withers. This is a surprising amount of work for some actually additions automation. Funny, this is the second time I've had to wait a ridiculous amount of time for a compressed refined EMC link, but we got one now. I just gotta hug it up to the old system and get everything up and running. Now that's what I call automation right there. There's a good bit going on here, but it basically just follows the principle of source item from EMC link. If it doesn't have EMC, source closest possible item and process it. That's pretty much how I ended up here. You know what's been bothering me for a while? My lack of omniscience. Sure, I've got that Mother Void Walker data model, but I'm not running that 24/7. I need all the knowledge, and I mean all of it. As I mentioned earlier on, though, this is far from a lofty aspiration. The Meatballcraft devs have decided that they hate TC6 research as much as everyone else does, and given the players a means of bypassing it entirely, at the cost of their sanity. As I've established last chapter, I no longer have any crumbs of sanity left, meaning this is a prime opportunity to obtain some forbidden knowledge. The recipe for the really scary Vishroom, strangely, relies more so on Abyssal-craft than it does Thaumcraft, which could have possibly been an inconvenience, but I've already been there and in fact have done that. Dreadium I have in storage, red matter has EMC, the only real hurdle here is anti-beef and anti-chicken, and calling them a hurdle is like making a hurdle out of a speed bump. Okay, that didn't really sound right. Moving on, before I go and make the anti-meats, I will gather the essentia I need for the recipe, as it is performed at an infusion altar. To prevent anything happening like last time, I put my essentia smeltery back out near the floating island of incredible misfortune. For a recipe that unlocks all research, it needs really little essentia. I sort of think it could be balanced better, to be honest. Anti-meats are basically just normal meats infused with antimatter, which should come as a surprise to absolutely no one. To make the antimatter, I need to make my first immersive engineering multi-block, well, apart from the blast furnace, that is. The mixer is used to combine water, dark matter, and extraterrestrial matter into antimatter, which I just pump into a tank for later meat-related purposes. And just like that, I've got the key to infinite knowledge, which I use over on the floating Great Pacific Garbage Patch, just in case anything too fluxy takes place. This was a needless concern though, just like the warp it gave me, which was so negligible the difference is actually hard to notice. As I progress through Chapter 2, I've realized that there is a very high demand for modularium casings. Meatballcraft adds a metric ton of new multi-blocks into the game, and as I unlock more and more of them, it's becoming very apparent that unless I want to spend hours upon hours manually crafting the casings, I'm gonna have to passive them. This is great news for me, as passiving automating items is my second favorite thing to do in this game. So step 1, I've got to revisit the Deep Dark, because apparently I didn't completely clear it out like I had thought. It didn't take much time for me to find what I needed though, which is a Flux Queen. This bee will help me automatically produce the flux made by smashing redstone with obsidian on bedrock, because I'm pretty sure there's no other way of passively automating it. On to the actual automation now. If you recall, a major ingredient in modular casings is Fiery Onion. Despite having already automated this 100 hours ago, I've decided to improve upon my setup a little and use a refined EMC link to supply all the necessary beef and cactuses while recycling their cooked variants. Like all Bewitchment setups, I'm going to need an altar to power this bad boy, so I set up one of these and boost it with some trinkets. With the power source in place, I begin construction of the oven setup, which goes much smoother than last time. I personally think that by far the most important aspect of automation is good cable management and filter handling. If you have strong and efficient logistics, making your build compact and fast should become much easier. I amn't very good at this though, but the device is putting out Fiery Onion pretty much as fast as the ovens allow, so I don't know. Next up on the dossier is the automation of Fluxed Electrum. This is made a rather easy process with the help of Nuclearcraft fluid infusers, one for the actual metal and the other for flux-infused gems, which are also required in casing production. The infusers are fed liquid redstone from a thermal crucible, while the Electrum and diamonds are supplied via an alloy smelter and the EMC link respectively. After the Fluxed Electrum is compacted into plates, the resulting products are combined into a fluxed armor plating and stored in a drawer. It's payoff time. All that effort I put into mystical agriculture is finally going to actually become significant, as now I've got to produce fluix for the sake of making flux cores. What I've got here is a very small crop harvesting setup that takes the fluix essence from the fluix crop, whose growth is sped up by a hydrator, processes it into fluix crystals, crushes them, then compresses them into pure fluix seeds, which are dropped into an accelerated growth chamber by an open crate. A vacuum hopper at the bottom of the chamber with a filter only collects fully grown fluix, then loads it into a drawer. Both flux cores and modularium casings themselves require Buildcraft chipsets, so I set up this sort of giant dual assembly table setup. Don't ask me too many questions about it. It's purely powered by hopes and dreams and could fall apart at any moment, but only right after it collapses my power grid. To actually produce the flux cores, I need to use an advanced crafting table from Extended Crafting. This means I have to partake in the hell that is automating one. Oh my god, why are they so hard to automate? You'd think a machine with an add-on block dedicated solely to automating it would be easy to automate, but it just isn't. I cannot emphasize this enough. There are very few mods I hate. I mean, pretty much every mod has something cool to bring to the table. The exception is extended crafting. Want to use a fuck ton of resources in one recipe? There are so many options, like oh my god, modular machines is literally right there. But nope, we gotta use this shit stain of a mod instead. It's just so counterintuitive to gate the only reasonable methods of automating these things past AE2 autocrafting. Like I do not want to be using crafting cards in order to passive stuff. The actual problem with the automation interface for extended crafting tables is the way they accept items. Basically, you can pipe an item in. If it fits into the table it is attached to, it will enter the table. Otherwise, it will be moved to an output slot to be extracted. See the problem? Say you have a bank of drawers attempting to input items. The interface has no way of telling the drawer bank not to input items, so will continually attempt to input them into one available slot. This results in either both slots filling up and jamming the system, or if you're extracting the items back out of the interface, an infinite cycle of items going through the interface, which is horrible for efficiency and TPS. I honestly don't think it would be that difficult if the mod had just allowed interfacing directly with its crafting tables. That way something like an existing item filter could just input the items where they should go, or have more than one slot in the interface so I could use a limited item filter for item insertion. Sadly, that's just not the reality we live in. Instead, I have to write a small Lua program to monitor when flux cards are produced so it can empty a cache of items in a drawer bank with the sole purpose of shutting down the main drawer outputs. Basically, cores are outputted into a drawer. The program detects the change in number of cores and outputs a redstone signal that allows several drawers to output their contents back to the main storage drawers. As the cores are crafted, excess items that are being sent to the interface's output slot are put into the computer-controlled cache. When an item enters the cache, the output of that item from the main drawers are locked until the cache is emptied. Yes, I am aware this is not the best way to automate this, and in fact, I will come up with a much better method using integrated dynamics later on, but it is a good excuse for me to use open computers, so I think it was worth it. If it isn't obvious, I have no plan to use this automation method ever again, so the two other interfaces get the nice old TPS destroying loop treatment, which, while working, is sort of the worst thing I've ever done. After another few ounces of jank involving one of the worst cable jobs I've ever done, I managed to automate modularium casings at last. Right on schedule too, as I think it's time we start speeding up my progression a little. The original purpose I had in progressing through mystical agriculture wasn't for fluic seeds at all. Instead, I planned to craft seeds of a slightly higher caliber. This here is an iridium seed, which, as one would expect, grows iridium. My biggest question here is why is it so easy to obtain high-tier seeds? Like, iridium as I see is supposed to be sort of a challenge to obtain in bulk, but the mere mention of its rarity and or value now will get you laughed out of the room once I upgraded it using my agricultural combs and planted it in my new crop farm with a combination of Actually Addition's greenhouse glass, Industrial Foregoing's hydrator, and Requillery's lilies of fertility, which are currently failing to render. I'm getting a few iridium essence almost once a second. Seeing this process's speed, I also make a similar growth module for titanium, which I will need in bulk along with iridium I'm producing to make my next goal. The truth is, I would love to expand my resource production. Specifically, I would like to build some more mythical void ore miners. Sadly, these things eat up power like it's Fat Tuesday, and my numismatic dynamos just can't handle the strain of even one of these being on the grid. The Meatballcraft devs, in their infinite wisdom, foresaw this problem and gifted us, the players, the compression engine. Now, I've generally stayed away from petroleum-based fuel sources for power production in most of my modded runs, excluding supersymmetry of course, but being in the green energy-wise while simultaneously running more than one void miner is something I'd like to see happen in my lifetime, so combustion it is. Unlike your typical fossil fuel, high-pressure energetic fluid fuel is neither non-renewable nor is it mainly composed of petroleum. I mean, it does have some petroleum product in it, but I think a majority of its power comes from all the magic dust I'm loading into it. Speaking of loading dust into it, this stuff is really cheap to produce. My main concern with fuel-based energy generation has always been my inability to passive it, but between the power of EMC and some thermal expansion machines, this shit is made trivial. Crush some coal, melt it, refine it a few times with blaze powder, and boom, you've got half the fuel already. As for the other half, that's just a matter of making some lava via melting some netherrack. A nice callback to how I was making power back in Chapter 1. then melt some glowstone and combine it with coal before mixing the resulting slurry with another slurry made from the lava after it has been melted together with some coins from the Y0 mob farm. We take slurry number 3 and mix it with the result of our coal refining, and we've got ourselves a steady supply of high-pressure energetic fluid, especially after handing out Signalum upgrades like cheap cigars. I'm not sure if the compression engine is supposed to be a cheap build, or my infrastructure grind is paying its dues, but it was not hard to make one of these things. The main components are steel, which comes down to how many blocks of iron I can shove in my smeltery at a time, titanium/iridium, which I'm growing at sub-Mach speeds, and modularium casings, which I've already talked about enough. Once hooked up to my fuel production setup, one of these hunks makes 45,000 RF a tick, which doesn't seem like a massive amount, but it's more than all of my numismatic dynamos combined. The compression engine's insane efficiency when it comes to power production, combined with its negligible cost, gives me the perfect excuse to build a second one, which I do immediately after completing the first, as why only produce 45,000 RF a tick when you could have 9,000. Seriously, the only problem with these guys is that I need to hook them up with individual flux plugs and send the power directly to my energy core because my cables are too slow to extract all its power fast enough. Speaking of power transportation, actually, I know this will probably bite me in the ass later on, but I'm going to avoid using draconic energy crystals/relays. I know that flux plugs are functionally the same, but those are a temporary measure I'm using before I automate cryo-stabilized flux ducts. It all boils down to the fact I like cabling up my bases. Half the reason I play this game is to see items move through pipes after all. Now that I had 90,000 RF a tick at my disposal, my first course of action was to build a nether mythical void miner. Like the overworld one, it will supply some useful materials. Well, really just a purple powder I make ender tanks and chests out of, but I'm sure the other resources will come in useful later down the line. I realize I might have been vague about what's driving my progression through this chapter, so before this next little switch up, I've made this cool explanation about my progression mythology. Basically, Meatballcraft has what I'd like to call an interlinked system of progression. No mod is isolated from any other, and progressing through them all is required to move forward. However, this isn't very apparent during Chapter 2, where you're bombarded with side quests that have very little to do with the actual way forward. But the truth is, those aren't so much side quests as they are main quests that just aren't relevant yet. In order to alleviate a monsoon of quests clogging up my progression pipeline later on, I've opted to get a bunch of the larger side quests out of the way as early as possible, like how I obtained the Undead Callstone and unlocked hard mode when that doesn't really become relevant until later on. With that being said, it's time to clean up the Twilight Forest. Thaumcraft's very own Crimson Cult has established a bunch of floating strongholds that hold a few relics I'll need later on. Flight is disabled in the Twilight Forest, so I had to do some bouncing to get up there, but once I did, I can attest to the fact that the Crimson Cult is really bad at flight. Makes me wonder how they got up here in the first place. Also, who thought it was a good idea to put the wizards who only know Fireball in a wooden structure? Anyway, on with killing some bosses. The Minoshroom was a piece of cake, so was the Hydra and the Phantomite. Wait a second, gotta pause the Twilight cleanup. I just spotted another Crimson Cult fortress. Man, they've got these guys packed in here like a can of sardines. Alright, on to the Alpha Yeti and the Snow Queen. I'm beginning to think I might be bringing a super magical electro blade to a knife fight, cause this is way too easy. I'm not gonna lie, Twilight Forest progression past the Snow Queen has always struck me as a little off. Maybe because it's not crawling through dungeons, but killing giant clones of myself that inhabit a cloud island and using their massive pickaxe to retrieve a lamp with the power to burn through thorns to approach a castle that will probably never have a boss in it just doesn't sit right with me. Meatballcraft does try to fix that problem by adding in some custom content of its own, starting with this amulet that summons an army of these red cube guys. I'm pretty sure last I checked they had an AI of a pig, so massacring them with my awesome lightning powers was really easy, even if they do have a sick name. Oh, Harbinger cubes. There's so much you could have been. Ooh la la, another Crimson Stronghold, and this one isn't even guarded. As they say, finders keepers. Anyway, the Harbinger crystals the Harbinger cubes drop are used in a rather expensive Broken Oathstone recipe, which happens to be my next goal. In terms of what I actually need, most of the items I already have due to my raiding of Crimson Fortresses. The Harbinger crystals are naturally already accounted for, and the bee trait should be no problem with my robust breeding infrastructure. The only concern here is that little gray ball. That is fading matter, a type of matter added in by Project EX with 261.21 billion EMC. This raises a major concern. My EMC production, working at its current speed, would take several days straight of idling before producing anything near that much EMC. which means it's upgrade time. I'm still debating with myself over whether or not the way I went about increasing my EMC production was the most efficient way possible, as I don't think it was, but I might just be wrong about that. Regardless of its efficiency, the first step in building what I've nicknamed the EMC bomb is killing as many dragons as possible, as the more dragon hearts I have, the more diamonds I can dupe simultaneously. After causing the dragon equivalent to the KT extinction, I can begin making my EMC bomb. I also decided to craft some yellorium seeds and have them idle in the background. This will not become important for at least another few days of playtime, but you know what I say, it's better to have a backlog of stuff when you don't need it than have none of the stuff when you do. Anyhow, the EMC bomb follows pretty much the same design schematic as the original diamond duper, just much larger, using 8 crafters instead of just 1. I also maxed out each crafter's available programs, which I think makes it parallel, but I'm not sure. To remove additional inefficiencies, I'm using compacting drawers to compress the diamonds into diamond blocks, because I am using normal Ender IO conduits to transport the blocks into the EMC link. From then on, the entire process is just repeating the same thing until I have the laggiest method of EMC production for the given amount of space possible. So, about 1.5 million EMC a second definitely isn't horrible. I mean, sure, that's 44 hours of waiting, but I've already got some of the EMC I need. Well, I had some of the EMC I need. It has since been compressed down to fun matter variants like lime matter and yellow matter. How exciting! After unlocking some more colors of the rainbow, I finally made it to white matter, which I can afford exactly 1 of. Thankfully, I only need 2 more of these guys until I get my fading matter, which I'm pretty sure isn't a color, but you do you, Project EX. Oh yeah, here's that bee I needed for the oath stone. Turns out both its constituent species were bred up in the process of getting the agricultural bee, so that's convenient. 44 hours is a lot of time to wait, though I would like to specify that the rate fluctuates from 1.5 million EMC a second slows to 3 million EMC a second highs, so 44 hours is really a crude estimate. So in the meantime, I decided to upgrade my Void Miner to Tier 3. This is only a matter of switching out some parts, as I already have all the resources required to do so. The benefits of passive automation really are bountiful. About the EMC bomb being laggy, yeah, it's timed my TPS to almost unbearable levels. I mean, the game is borderline unplayable right now. Of course, I'm not going to turn it off. I still need that precious EMC. It's just that I can't really do anything else in the meantime without the lag making me want to drive a fork through my eye socket. After what seemed like an endless wait, I finally got my fading matter. Time to make a broken oath stone. How exactly it comes pre-broken is as much a mystery to me as it is to you, but who knows? Infusion works in mysterious ways. Speaking of infusion, do you like my altar's new look? It got some spanking upgrades after my little trip to the emptiness, and now it glows purple. I used the oath stone over at the final castle to summon what I suppose is Meatballcraft's fill-in for the Twilight Forest's final boss, who turns out to be a blue guy with a lot of health. Like always, the fight is just a matter of right-clicking, though I forgot to turn the EMC bomb off, so it's a little more of a slog than usual. Anyway, this guy drops a callstone that when used spawns this mirror structure with a bee that is currently completely useless to me in it. Like I said though, this is all about playing the long game. The Twilight Forest still has more to offer apparently, as the Harbinger crystals I gathered earlier can be crafted into another callstone. That being said, it won't come cheap. Saying that after getting the fading matter can be kind of misleading. I mean, it won't be easy. It's definitely cheaper than the Broken Oath Stone. What makes this callstone so expensive is the 4 Mythmanite ingots required to make it. Mythmanite is an endgame metal added by some random Thaumcraft add-on that requires a bunch of Essentia, Void Metal, random magical knickknacks, and nether stars. In order to minimize as much Thaumcraft crafting as possible, I make mystical agriculture seeds for Void Metal. While it hasn't really been in scarcity, I know that it soon will be with the amount of lower tier metals I am required to craft before obtaining Mythmanite. After a quick trip to the flux fields to juice up the Essentia I'll need for the infusion, I make my first Mithrilium ingot, and the infusion altar doesn't even spontaneously combust. Here's the problem. I don't need 1 ingot, I need 36 at the minimum. The abhorrent Essentia costs are partially covered by my new Mithrilium Essentia smelter, which doesn't produce flux, but it still takes an excessive amount of time to produce all the requisite Essentia for the infusion and get the ingots crafted. The 36 shiny, fresh off the press ingots of Mithrilium have been reserved for the explicit purpose of making their successors easier to craft. Meatballcraft's custom multi-blocks aren't only for its unique processes, but also for making processes added in by other mods easier. The arcane auto-infuser is not only faster than a default infusion setup, but it lacks the stability mechanic, and Essentia is added through V crystals as part of the items required to craft the item in the first place, so automating them is much easier. This little device I'm building now will convert Essentia coming from a smeltery into crystals at absolutely no cost. Not only does this allow me to store Essentia in drawers, but it also makes all infusion crafting with the Arcane Auto Infuser trivial. With those systems in place, crafting Mythmanite and its precursor Adamanite are simply matters of loading my smelter with random items and waiting, then loading the items into the auto-infuser. Yep, I've taken all the thom out of Thaumcraft and have returned it back to the default playstyle of any mod, which is move items from one place to another, repeat forever. Of course, producing Essentia does take time, so in the meanwhile, I automate some frequently used Advent of Ascension resources with Mystical Agriculture. Honestly, I don't know why these ingots are so expensive. Remember back when I was explaining why I chose the Pallades armor? This is why. Anyway, here's the Abadamite, which took absolutely no time in our new auto-infuser. And the Mithril took no time as well. This thing is definitely one of my better multi-block investments, along with the compression engines, of course. And here's our Harbinger Callstone. What does it summon? Another one of those stupid Crimson Strongholds. They really need to employ some new strategy here. Walking out of the building while it is under attack doesn't really work when the attackers are able to leap over you regardless of your ability to shoot homing projectiles. The dungeon was sort of a blowout like usual, with the only loot being the Twilight Forest dungeon trees and a Starfield gem, which might have potential uses soon, maybe? I'm sure you remember my absolutely disastrous attempt at automating the extended crafting table. Well, I've come up with a much, much slicker design. Saying that implies that the design itself is slick, which it isn't. It's just a massive improvement when compared to whatever yacht I was rocking on with the original open computer design. Seeing as the design itself really isn't too compact, I've decided I'd like to shove them into a compact machine where they won't take up as much space in my base. That being said, I need borax for compact machines, which is a processing rabbit hole with a lot of nuclear craft machines. So what's better than testing my design with some passive nuclear craft plating, eh? This new design's backbone is Integrated Dynamics, a mod that which I learned specifically for this purpose. Seeing as passively automating extended crafting with a non-resource intensive method might actually be helpful for those in a similar situation to me, I'm going to give y'all a good lecture on its schematics. This is the resource bank. All resources for any recipes attached to the system need to be stored here. Next, set up your crafting table and interface. Make sure you know where the interface will output items to. I have mine outputting to its right side so it doesn't interfere with any automation. Do note that output directions are specified by cardinal directions. Set the recipe for the interface and power it. This should be all you need to do on extended crafting's end. The Ender IO conduit and chest on top make up the second gate of the machine. Yes, I'm building them in reverse. Yes, you'll see why. The chest also gets a conduit on top. Make sure to set the bottom conduit to redstone control high so it only outputs items when given a signal. Alright, now you'll want another chest. This one will be the first gate. It will redstone control low on the output conduit. Attach an input conduit to the back of the first gate and give it a limited item filter with the exact amount of items the recipe will need. Put another identical filter on the input of gate 2. This will ensure there will always be the right amount of items in both gates. Here's where Integrated Dynamics comes in. Place an inventory reader on the second gate and a redstone writer on each of the redstone controlled conduits. Hook these together and attach them to a variable store. Next, you're going to need some sort of toggleable block. I'm using the toggle latch from Project Red because it best serves my purposes, but you could potentially make it work without one. I place it diagonally from my gates behind the logic cable connecting the writers and readers. Technically, you only need 3 of these, with the reader furthermost from the crafter being vestigial, but I didn't write this tutorial that way, sorry about that. Variable card time. This is where you might get lost if you're not familiar with Integrated Dynamics, but I assure you everything will be okay. One variable card will be binded to the number of items in gate 2. Not the types of items, the number of them. The next will be an integer equivalent to the exact amount of items the recipe takes up. My recipe is a full 3x3 grid, so my number is 9. This card needs to be programmed in the logic programmer. Find yourself the relation equals argument in the logic programmer and use the 2 previously programmed cards to set the conditional. So basically, if amount of items in gate 2 equals amount of items needed in recipe, this variable card will output either true or false, which we can use to manipulate redstone. Encode a new variable card with the value of 0 and put it into another inventory conditional. So if inventory amount equals integer 0, the boolean will be true. Place all cards that store an integer in the variable store. Now go to a redstone reader and program 2 new cards with the boolean output of said reader. This should be the second option down. Then go to the reader of the opposite side of the toggle latch and set it to the boolean output as well. The sides technically do not matter as long as you know which is which. Now put one of each of your redstone conditional statements in the redstone writers under the first available slot. Again, it doesn't matter which one you place where. Now put your redstone cards binded to the readers into the redstone writers on the conduits. If the device doesn't begin working, flip the toggle level once. This machine works as follows for those curious. Basically, if gate 2 fills up, the system will toggle, closing the gate from gate 1 to gate 2, while at the same time allowing items from Gate 2 to enter the extended crafting interface. Once Gate 2 is empty, the system toggles again, filling Gate 2 until it is yet again full. This prevents any of the strange overflow problems the interfaces have, and is, in my opinion, a much cooler method of automation than AE2. Also, about hiding these away in compact machines, I've changed my mind. These things are dope as fuck. My original design wasn't as vertically oriented and looked much sloppier, so I thought I'd have to pack it away, but that isn't the case anymore. I proceed to build another one of these things to handle higher tier nuclear craft plating. They are pretty cheap after all. As I gave y'all quite a long-winded explanation, unless you skipped it or something, I'm not going to delve into the nuances of borax production all too much. It comes down to crushing rocks, putting them into solution, mixing it around a later, rinse and repeat until I have myself a very tedious to obtain dust. Sorry, Meatballcraft, I just find Sussy's chem lines a little more engaging. I guess that's because I don't have Ender IO conduits and magic water boxes, though. Maybe constraining your players can make the game more fun. Even though I'm no longer building anything inside of compact machines, I think crafting the fuel projectors could still be useful, as apparently they're used for some custom crafting processes. Or maybe just because I don't want to admit to the fact I wasted a lot of time automating borax. Looks like I can automate some nether resources the same way I automated those AOA ones with mystical agriculture. This setup here automates a few more of the more frequently required ones, like blood gem, enderstone, and nether. Oh no. Oh dear god, not. Remember how I like doing these annoying callbacks to earlier parts of the episode by saying remember? Well, this one might actually require you to think a little. Remember that gargantuan drum that might have possibly invoked premonitions of a dark obelisk of incomprehensible scale? It's become relevant. 9 out of 10 dentists can agree that this is generally a net negative for the human race, but I don't think a single one can tell you why. But don't worry, I can. Legend tells of a dimension known simply as the Furnace Dimension, a realm where furnaces roam free and unworried about the challenges of daily life. Also, according to legend, the flint and steel required to get there requires the heat of a full gargantuan drum of netherite before activating. That is, putting it lightly, a fuck ton of netherite. Now, this will be considerably harder if this was vanilla netherite, but thankfully Meatballcraft has supplied me with this nice little dupe where I can use nether essence to turn 1 ingot into 1 ore, then turn the ore into 4 ingots using the nether essence I'm growing with mystical agriculture. Of course, this isn't so much a matter of can I make netherite as much as it is how fast can I make it. The limiting factors here are the speed of my induction smelters, the speed of which I can make pyrotheum to fuel them, and most importantly the speed of my nether essence production. The speed of my induction smelters can be increased through upgrades. I shouldn't have to worry about pyrotheum for a while due to my large sulfur stocks over at my passive alloy setup, but the nether essence is another monster entirely. I need a lot of nether essence. How much exactly? I'm not really sure, probably floating somewhere in the millions. That means I need to grow a lot of it. Seeing as I have been practically limitless resources to expend on this project between my EMC and mystical agriculture setups, I decided to solve the problem the stupidest way possible and decide to just grow more crops as soon as seeds become available. This works, but at the same time results in some pretty shitty rates, I'm not gonna lie. So apparently one fully upgraded induction smelter has nowhere near enough power to process all the netherite ingots I'm gonna need. Guess I'll just install more and hope my pyrotheum production can keep up with them. I know the Furnace Dimension is supposed to be difficult to get to, but this is going to take a ridiculous amount of time. In the meanwhile, I may as well prepare the next stage of netherite processing, as I'm not actually melting the netherite or putting it in a drum yet. This might be a critically acclaimed stupid idea, as obviously it's going to take about as long as for me to melt the stuff than it has taken for me to make it. Wait. Actually, that's not true. Between a massive tinker smeltery and fluid lasers from Actually Additions, it should really take less than a minute to melt down and transfer the netherite into the drum. That means I need to build this giant black box though, which symbolizes this whole process really well in my opinion. Turns out that Empowerer automation actually turned out to be helpful, as now I've got a few stacks of fluid lasers to play with. While I originally attached them to smaller drums attached to super laminal fluid ducts, I realized that this whole setup negated the entire point of using the fastest fluid transportation in the game, so I just attached the fluid lasers directly to the smelter. After waiting for a few million years, my netherite was finally ready for the great melting, so I simply picked up the compact drawer from the insertion area, flew over to my smelter, and began hand-fisting the stuff straight into it. After a surprisingly short amount of time, my gargantuan drum was full, allowing me to empower my flint and furnace and enter the furnace dimension. There's a few things to do besides gathering furnaces here, the first being pressing this button. The guys at Summon should drop the resources for the first of many furnace callstones, so I go and beat them over the head with my sword as per the usual. The rest of the Furnace Dimensions progression is pretty much the same. Use a Callstone, kill the Furnace Head guy summoned in by it, and whatever he dropped to make a new Callstone, and the cycle repeats. I will say though, I do not appreciate the Furnace guys getting harder. It already took 100 hits to kill the first guy, and the second one has his own personal army. After the green guy's unfortunate passing, I put the whole Furnace mission on hold, as there's something that's been nagging me for a bit that I want to take care of. Sadly, this matter of housekeeping will require some... how do I put this? Finagling to take care of, so I put Last Stand on my armor in case anything gets out of hand. This task also requires some specialty tools, so I grab a few flux points and industrial mob grinders. I'd rather not get my hands too dirty, after all. Anyway, now it's off to the end. I do as the quest book says, and it wants me to kill the Chaos Guardian. So you may be thinking that I am very bad at killing the Chaos Guardian, especially considering I was cheesing the entire fight. This is true. I have never fought it before, and hopefully I will never have to again. At least not like that. Regardless, I got myself my Chaos Crystal, so it's back to killing Furnace Men. This one was in an annoying maze that made it somehow take even longer to kill than its predecessors, but it's fine as I think there's only one more. Unlike the previous Callstones, this last one requires a bunch of strange and exotic resources. Dragon bones, bee combs, there's really just a little bit of everything in here. However, the item that proves to be the biggest problem are fire crystals from Railcraft. They come from an incredibly rare ore in the Nether, which is so rare in fact that attempting to obtain it in the intended way is a completely fruitless endeavor. Thankfully, my environmental tech ore miner has been producing this stuff for a good while now, so I have quite a big stock to get started with. I need a lot of fire crystals for this damn Callstone. This is a good excuse to speed up my ore miner though, so I go down and build a void resource miner with my leftover tier 2 ports. This machine produces a bunch of building blocks along with talc, a block I need to make the speed modifiers for the void ore miner. Despite the upgrades, it still takes a criminally long time for me to get all the fire crystals I need. I don't think I'm allowed to complain about this though, as I know full well I am not supposed to be at this point in the Furnace Dimension. This is especially apparent upon me using the Callstone, when it warns me that I should be wearing late game gear. You know what's not late game gear, but is just as powerful? You guessed it, Oh, you've got to be kidding me. Hold on, I'm going to circumvent this real fast. There we go. Mob Crushers. Mob Crushers are just as powerful as any late game weapon, if not more powerful to be honest. I do need a lot of them though. This boss is ridiculous. Is doing this cheating? It is avoiding the rules, but I am using mechanics that are completely acceptable to do so. Well, if it's not cheating, it's certainly a little scummy, but seeing as I'm currently at Chapter 2 and this guy is late game, I see no other option. And there is no way I'm letting the Furnace Dimension sit uncompleted. This guy's quest was in the Chapter 2 section, mind you. To be fair, it's not like I'll be using this guy's drops anytime soon. What's that? A message from the Bureau of Obnoxious and Inefficient Automation? What? I haven't met my quota for this chapter. Well, oh boy, do the folks at the BOIA have something coming their way. I'd like to preface this with the fact I did not know Myth Midnight eggs existed at the time. I honestly thought this was the only way I could possibly automate Myth Midnight given my current game state. Even though I was completely wrong in that regard, I do not regret automating it in the slightest, as it turns out it will come in useful later. So, Myth Midnight. That expensive ingot I used for that one Callstone in the Twilight Forest. It might be hell to automate, but the more difficult it is to automate, the cooler the setup will be once it's finished. This is actually a law of reality, by the way. The first step in Myth Midnight production is the passive production of the basic Domcraft resources that make up Mythrilium, which is Myth Midnight's precursor. The first resource I automated was amber, which could be automated with chickens similarly to how mithril should have been. Basically, this multi-block just pumps out eggs based on the egg in its input, and those eggs can be processed into different resources, with different eggs requiring different methods of processing. I am very glad I spent so much time automating modular casings, because this next step is considerably expensive. It turns out trying to automate every type of essentia I need for 4 different infusion recipes isn't really that easy. I'm not going to go super in depth to this device because I'm not super proud of it, and as I've discussed before, its existence is redundant, but basically this is an array of essentias to V crystal converters, as this setup is naturally going to rely on auto infusers. The absolutely massive mithrilium price tag that comes from this operation has thankfully been covered by my pre-existing auto infuser, which is working overtime to meet the price of the new auto infusers and mithrilium smelteries. After designing the most obnoxious array of smelteries I've ever witnessed, I assembled the first of the auto infusers, which will be dedicated to mithrilium production. Then I assembled the auto infusers dedicated to adamanite production below it. Like pretty much every system I've built in this pack, it fully relies on limited item filters for recipe control. Yeah, I'll admit that maybe I should be getting into XNAP, but I didn't think of it at the time. I also built an arcane auto workbench, which is a version of the auto infuser made to perform crafting tasks from the arcane workbench. It'll help supply enchanted fabric for the mithrilium. I'm going to be real here. Automating mithril took a really long time. The sad part is, most of the time was either waiting for items to process or setting filters. Yeah, I've still got a long way to go when it comes to infrastructure, I think. Regardless, after the construction of another 2 auto infusers, one for primordial pearls and the other for mithril respectively, I finally had my automated mithril production. Woohoo! Despite being completely redundant in pretty much every regard, the mithril I produced can help me with my next goal, the Terra Shield. According to my sources, this thing will bring my conditional mortality up to almost unconditional, with a few exceptions, as it gives me more absorption hearts than one could ever really need. There are a few ways to craft this thing, and I'm currently going with what I think is the most reasonable one for my given tier. That being said, it does require a lot of resources, with one of them being the expensive Twilight Diamond. This item, well technically its precursor, the Twilight Jewel, requires several expensive items from the late stages of every major Chapter 2 mod, the first of which being Mithril. The second is the Crystal Cluster from Blood Magic, which happens to be the same item that makes up Tier 6 altars. Meatballcraft has gated Tier 6 altars behind a small dungeon in the Nether that requires a key composed of items infused with extremely high amounts of blood to enter. I'm sick of using the traditional method to gather blood, so after reconstructing my altar far above my base, I've decided to fall back to the ever-trusty Deep Mob evolution. It turns out Meatballcraft includes this cool add-on that makes generating blood from mobs a simple matter of placing a black box near your blood altar and giving it a data model. Seeing as I need hundreds of thousands of millibuckets of blood, I use the Ender Dragon data model accelerated with Twilight Matter in order to get the best possible rate. It still takes a long time to generate enough blood for the operation, but it's faster than it would have been otherwise. As the blood generates, I retrieve some of the Bloodmaster armor that's been gathering up in my Y0 mob farm and compress it into blocks, as these blocks are the precursor to what I will have to infuse in the blood altar. Once compressed, I use some alchemy to make the blocks into fragments of unraveling, which are shipped to the altar for infusion. Apparently, infusing them with blood destabilizes them, as I now have 8 unstable fragments of unraveling, which I craft into the Call to Limbo. After combining the Call to Limbo with some Fabric of Reality, I use the resulting Vengeance key to enter the dungeon, where I beat the living daylights out of a couple guards, then steal some crystals. Not crystal clusters, mind you. I simply stole the ingredients I will need to craft the Retaliation key, which won't get me the crystal clusters either, just allow for their creation. After the Retaliation key allows me to take a sneak peek into the attic of the Blood Dungeon, I retrieve the Demonic Crystal Cluster and proceed to craft 4 normal Crystal Clusters, which I install into my altar. Access to Crystal Clusters puts me just 1 item away from being able to craft the Twilight Jewel, as I've already progressed through Botania. This last item is an incredibly pure and refined crystal from Astral Sorcery. Thankfully, as I mentioned before, Astral Sorcery is by far the easiest mod to progress through, at least time-wise, so I guess it's off to staring at the sky and connecting some dots. Light wells are a major part of Astral Sorcery progression, as the liquid starlight they produce is essential to making a good portion of its content. Usually aquamarine is used to gather starlight, but anyone versed in Astral Sorcery might notice the fact I'm using rock crystals. If I didn't have an infinite supply of these, the sight of this might make me cringe a little, but I do, as my environmental tech miner seems very adamant on digging these things up. Next up in terms of progression was the production of star metal, which is surprisingly little usage for being the only metal Astral Sorcery adds, but what little use it does have is important, so I do make a mystical agricultural seed for it. As Astral Sorcery's progression isn't really modified by Meatballcraft and the process isn't very difficult, I'm not going to give a blow-by-blow here and just focus on some of the highlights. Here's me upgrading my crafting altar so I can progress through the mod. This here is the Starlight Infuser, the most annoying multi-block ever conceived. See those pools of liquid starlight that are inlaid into the floor? Occasionally some of it will be consumed upon infusing some aquamarine. Replacing this liquid starlight gets very annoying, very fast, but that doesn't stop me from fast tracking to the attunement altar. Have I mentioned how cool Astral Sorcery is yet? Cause damn, stuff like this is cool. Attuning yourself to a constellation unlocks a perk tree, which can give you an array of buffs. The constellation you attune to will determine what perks you have access to at first, and performing a certain task specific to your constellation will allow you to unlock more of them. I chose Visio, which just requires me to run around a lot. Visio has always been my trusted go-to constellation, as it is close to Armara, which grants health, while also granting me a much-needed speed boost and an easy way of farming perk points. And when I say Armara grants health, I mean it grants a fuck ton of health. Spice of Life and Heart Canisters can go jump off a bridge. This is the future of health right here. Once I upgraded my altar to the final tier, I could begin my operation to obtain the refined crystal I need. Basically, instead of having to go through the typical process that is grinding down, then reshaping, then grinding down some more, then so on and on and on, I'm just going to form the crystal in a machine and call it a job well done. Except apparently it isn't, because I didn't notice the recipe of the refined crystal requires deep blue matter, something I could not obtain yet. Well, I guess it's off to manually refining the crystals. Calling this a grind is no understatement. I don't really want to describe the horrors that make up crystal refinement. Just imagine that you are trying to increase a set of 3 numbers, but increasing one to its fullest state will decrease the rest. Yeah, it sucked. Once I had refined the gem though, I tuned it to Armara and crafted the Twilight Jewel, which I converted to a Jewel of the Twilight Forest before using it to make some Twilight Gems. Yeah. So this is awkward. Turns out that this whole recipe isn't going to work out. It simply is impossible for me to obtain all the items to craft the Terra Shield while staying in Chapter 2. Maybe I should have checked all the items in the recipe before busting my ass like that, but don't fret, dear viewer. I'm now even more motivated to get the Terra Shield. How? Whatever the hell this recipe is. Celestial Shield fragments are apparently obtained through a master spell, which is an incredibly powerful item that is formed by compressing a huge amount of Thaumcraft V crystals and combining the result with some random ass items. The problem is, there is a master spell for each and every Thaumcraft aspect, and there is basically no information out there on which master spell does what. Being the logician I am, however, I deduct that it's most likely the Primonio or Protection master spell. After using the Ascension setup from the Mythmanite automation to obtain all the crystals for the spell, all I need to do is obtain Peat, as the master spell, Focus, the core of the spell, needs V pods, which are grown in a phytogenic insulator. I don't want to build a forestry farm multi-block though, so I'm going to try and get my bees to make peat. I'm just going to say that idea failed so horribly that we're just skipping straight to the peat farm. Here's the phytogenic insulator, the V-pods, the spell focus, and finally the master spell. Here's hoping it's the right one, and nope, it summons a damn zombie. Seeing as I've been after the shield for a few days at this point, I get mildly frustrated at this setback and decide to just peek into the files to figure out which spell does what. And it turns out that our good old shield fragments come from what is by far the most expensive spell, Master Spell Calais, or God. This aspect is only found in certain precious metals such as Mithrilium, Mythmanite, and Adamite. You know, it would be real convenient if I happen to have access to a massive stockpile of Calais' rich resources. The Mythmanite automation, which I had basically considered a waste of space and TPS up until now, is finally fulfilling a purpose, allowing me to obtain the Master Spell Calais in record-breaking time. But you look at that, we've got shield fragments falling straight from the heavens. Finally, the Terra Shield is within reach, and there it is. Damn, so now what? Well, I think it's time for a rematch with our favorite anime reference. I mean, we are immortal after all. Here we go, round 4. You know, immortality's a fucking scam. Sure, I said it was conditional, but more specifically, it's conditional on the fact that my opponent doesn't deal void damage, but that doesn't stop me from being angry. Hey, there's still more 2 attempts. And besides, maybe I just didn't bring enough apples. Round 5, baby, let's hit it! Apparently bringing more apples did very much help. I'd like to note that by the end of this fight, I was literally trembling from the amount of adrenaline coursing through my system. This is the first time I've ever felt that way from a Minecraft boss, so I guess I do have to give that to the extra botany devs. But what was this all for anyway? Nothing, because the next Botania goal was gated past the GAIA Guardian 3. I love everything so much. Seeing as this matter of progression involves killing a Meatballcraft boss, I set up a grinder as it probably has a ludicrous amount of health. Yep, it probably one-shots me too, but I'm not testing that out, thank goodness for the trusty grinder. That's Botania all wrapped up. What's next? Well, I was going to clean up the Betweenlands, but seeing as my hard drive is about to start overflowing if I record any more footage, I think I'm actually just gonna finish up the chapter. Instead of boring you to death in these last minutes, I'm gonna keep it simple. I have a box of several thousand ingots of yellorium. Yeah, remember that? Anyway, I'm loading it into this reactor here to obtain some cyanite waste products, which can be compressed into plutonium, which is processed into ludicrite. You know, I think you get the idea. At the end of the day, I'm just looking to make a warper core, which is our gateway to chapter 3. After obtaining the required waste, I just need to grind out a few simple resources from a few mods. And here it is, the warper core. That took, well, in the context of its individual crafting, not that much time at all. But in terms of the entire chapter, well, yeah. This video was long. Really long. Much longer than I wanted it to be. That being said, thank you so much for watching. I know the pacing was off, I'm not the best narrator, and the editing was probably rough around the edges, but this video alone took a month of working every day just to edit, and 6 months to actually play the mod pack and gather the footage. So really, if you watched through this entire video, or even just skipped through it, thank you so much for watching. In terms of my next Meatballcraft installment, it will be an intermission, as I've decided while editing this video, moving my base into a void dimension would be the best way forward. I don't know when exactly that video will be ready, but you can count on it containing very little commentary and a lot of building. So yeah, thank you for watching, and have a great day.